Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of the most cursed romantic resumes in human history. Yes, we're talking about King Henry VIII and the 6 brave souls who had the misfortune of becoming his wives. So get ready, because if you've ever thought your dating life was tragic, this story might make you feel wildly successful in comparison. Just a heads up though, you probably won't survive this. Seriously, statistically, if you're one of his wives, you're getting either divorced, beheaded, or ghosted into an abbey. It's not great. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments what city you're watching from and what time it is. I want to see who's losing sleep in which time zone. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are Catherine of Aragon, daughter of the famed Isabella and Ferdinand of Spain, the same pair who kicked out the Moors and financed Christopher Columbus. You've got more Catholic credentials than the Pope himself, and a wardrobe so heavy with gold thread is honestly a core workout just to sit down. Your whole life, you've been trained to be a queen, etiquette drilled into your skull, languages fluent, prayers memorised. You even have a coat of arms featuring a pomegranate because subtlety isn't a royal trait. At 15, you're shipped off to England to marry Prince Arthur, the heir to the English throne. He's skinny, pale, and recites Latin poetry like it's a love language, which it's not. You marry him in a lavish ceremony, and 5 months later, he dies. Probably from sweating sickness. But rumours swirl that he was just too delicate for royal duty. You're now a widow in a strange country where no one cares how many vowels are in your last name. To make matters worse, you're left hanging for years, basically the world's most expensively dressed houseguest, while Spain and England squabble over what to do with you. Enter Prince Henry, Arthur's younger brother. He's tall, athletic, charming, and smells like he bathes more than once a month, which puts him in the upper 1% of Tudor hygiene. At first, he's the Renaissance dreamboat. He writes music, speaks multiple languages, jousts like a champ. When he becomes king in 1509, he decides to marry you. It's romantic for about 5 minutes. You're 6 years older than him, but he seems into it. There's talk of destiny and divine favour, and for a little while you actually feel like things might be okay. But you're also entering what might be the deadliest role in Europe, royal womb. Your primary job now is to give birth to a healthy male heir, and the pressure is suffocating. You do get pregnant several times. Each time the court holds its collective breath. Some babies are stillborn, others die within days. One little boy survives for almost 2 months. You start to feel cursed. You pray harder, fast more, sleep less. Eventually you give birth to Mary, a healthy daughter, but Henry is polite at best. He doesn't celebrate. He just mutters something about trying again soon. You can already feel the love thinning out. Years pass. You're still technically queen, still attending court functions in your jewelled headdresses and velvet gowns, but there's a tightness behind your smile. Henry's looking more and more irritated every time you see him. Whispers slither through the palace halls, maids, ambassadors, even bishops commenting on your bad luck. You try not to cry in public. Your ladies-in-waiting carry your secrets like medicine bottles. Then one day you notice something. A young, sharp-tongued girl at court, Anne Boleyn. She's not conventionally beautiful. Long neck, slight overbite, too many fingers maybe, or maybe not. But she's magnetic. She's witty, fashionable, and flirtatious in a way that's more chess than checkers. And Henry, he's obsessed. You watch from across the room as he follows her like a lovesick puppy. You try to pretend it's just another court flirtation. It's not. Soon he's writing her love letters. Literally love letters. And you're still here, silently bleeding from yet another miscarriage. Anne won't sleep with him. That's her move. She says she'll only give herself to him as queen. Bold. And Henry? He's so smitten, he actually considers it. Not just considers it, he acts on it. He decides he wants a divorce. This is not a simple matter. You're Catholic, and so is basically all of England. Divorce isn't just frowned upon, it's heresy. Henry claims your marriage was never valid to begin with, citing some obscure Bible verse about marrying your brother's wife being cursed. Never mind that the Pope already approved it years ago. Never mind that you insist you never consummated your first marriage with Arthur. Logic doesn't matter. Henry wants out, and Anne wants in. You're dragged through public hearings, forced to defend your honour, in front of judges who are scared stiff of royal backlash. You plead your case, kneeling before Henry in full view of the court, but he looks away. That's the moment you know. You've already lost. You're stripped of your title. You're no longer queen. You're now Dowager Princess of Wales, a cruel callback to your first dead husband. You are exiled from court. Your beloved daughter Mary is taken from you and declared illegitimate. Letters to her are censored. You're left in cold, crumbling castles, banned from seeing the king or attending mass in your native Spanish. Still, you refuse to say your marriage wasn't valid. You refuse to recognise Anne as queen. You hold on to your dignity like its armour, even as your health fades. Alone, ill, betrayed. You die in 1536 heartbroken. Some say your heart was found blackened upon autopsy. Others whisper that it was poisoned. But maybe it was just that real, exhausting kind of grief. The kind that makes your organs give up too. And somewhere, not far away, Anne Boleyn prepares for her coronation. You don't even get a funeral fit for a queen. Your coffin is carried into Peterborough Abbey in the dead of winter, the service bleak and nearly empty. No royal procession, no official mourning. But strangely, the common people remember you. They whisper prayers under their breath. They call you the true queen, even as Henry parades his new wife around in French silks and peacock feathers, and you're gone. Erased from tapestries, removed from court records, your daughter Mary tucked away like a family secret. But let's not linger, because now you're Anne Boleyn, and you're stepping right into the fire. You think you've won. You really do. From Lady-in-Waiting to Queen of England, it's the ultimate royal upgrade. You wear your crown in front of a massive crowd, though it's not quite the rock star welcome you'd imagined. Some cheer, sure, but others spit as you pass. You've been called everything from whore to sorceress, and behind your back nobles still toast to Catherine's health. The court is split like an overripe fig, sweet and sour, and you're stuck trying to glue it all together with court dances and witty banter. But now the pressure starts to calcify. Catherine couldn't produce a son, and neither can you. You get pregnant quickly, and that first time it's a daughter, Elizabeth. And while Henry smiles through his teeth and throws a banquet, you know he's not satisfied. You can see it in the way he downs his wine that night, in the way he doesn't visit the nursery and how he leaves court a little too often. You give it time, you try again. But the next pregnancy ends in a miscarriage, then another, and then a ghost of a child, possibly a boy, born too early to live. Your body is failing you, and with every loss, Henry grows colder. He starts muttering about God's punishment. You start noticing how he no longer touches your hand in public, how he rides out with Jane Seymour, that suspiciously modest lady-in-waiting with big eyes and no opinions. Your nerves get the better of you. You start fighting back, publicly. You yell at Henry, snap at courtiers, push back when Jane smiles a little too long. You're not quiet. You were never quiet. But now, being outspoken feels less like strength and more like suicide. Even your allies begin to shift their loyalties. You're being watched, closely. And then the rumours start. They say you bewitched Henry with your eyes, that you had 6 fingers on one hand, that you made a pact with Satan and danced in the moonlight. It sounds ridiculous until you remember, this is England in the 1500s. People believe this stuff. The real charges, though, are more political than mystical. You're accused of adultery, with 5 men, including your own brother. It's a circus of manufactured confessions, shaky testimonies, and royal rage. The trials are a farce. The verdict is already written. You're sentenced to death. Not just death, beheading. But in a show of royal mercy, Henry imports a swordsman from France, so you won't be butchered with an axe like some common criminal. You thank him for this kindness. Yes, really. You actually thank the man who ordered your death. The night before your execution, you pray. You write letters. You joke with your ladies-in-waiting, because what else is there to do? You wear a simple grey gown, pin your hair beneath a white cap, and walk to the scaffold with a grace that unnerves even your enemies. You kneel. You make no accusations. You don't mention the lies, the betrayal, or the husband who's already planning his next wedding. The sword falls cleanly. Your head is shown to the crowd. Somewhere, Henry eats a lavish breakfast. A few days later, he marries Jane Seymour. But here's where it gets weird. Your daughter, the baby you left behind, will one day become Queen Elizabeth I. She'll reign for 45 years. She'll go down in history as one of England's greatest monarchs, and she'll do it unmarried, childless, and in full control. Maybe because she saw what happened to you. Maybe because she knew the price women paid just for being near a king. Still, in your lifetime, you were just a bump in Henry's road. Brilliant, bold, ultimately breakable. Your rise was meteoric. Your fall was catastrophic. You were the second queen, but the first to be executed. Catherine was exiled. You were erased. The official records say you died a traitor. But historians still debate the truth. Some argue you were framed by Thomas Cromwell, Henry's political bulldog, as a scapegoat to protect the king's pride. Others say Henry genuinely believed the charges, that paranoia had finally consumed him. Or maybe, in a twisted way, he just wanted to clear the stage for someone quieter, easier, less threatening. No one can agree, not fully. But one thing is certain. Being Henry VIII's wife is starting to look less like a fairy tale, and more like a trapdoor disguised as a throne. You are Jane Seymour now, and your coronation never happens. That's your first red flag, though no one dares to say it out loud. Anne had a crown, parades, and fireworks. You get silence. It's barely been 2 weeks since Anne's head rolled off her shoulders, and already the court is adjusting to your presence like you're a piece of expensive furniture. Everyone is watching you. Some with curiosity, some with dread, and many just waiting to see if you'll survive the king's expectations. Spoiler, you won't. You're not like the others. You've made your entire personality calm. Soft voice, modest gowns, lowered eyes. You know exactly what you're doing. Henry calls you his true wife. Though let's be honest, he said that about the last one too. But he's gentler with you at first. Maybe it's because you don't argue with him. Or maybe because you don't speak much at all. He says you're the perfect woman, which in Tudor code means you smile, you sew, and you don't have opinions about religious reform or foreign alliances. But even with your quiet charm, there's one task you must complete to truly lock in your place, and that's delivering a son. Not just a child, not another girl, a son. The Tudor dynasty is still wobbling like a lopsided cake, and Henry is obsessed with securing it. It doesn't matter how many golden goblets you raise at feasts or how many times the king calls you his jewel. If your womb doesn't cooperate, you're replaceable. Thankfully, or maybe tragically, you conceive pretty quickly. The entire court holds its collective breath for 9 months. Every move you make is monitored. What you eat, how you walk, how long you sleep. You're basically a glorified human incubator. But you endure it, partly because you've been trained to see this as your highest purpose, and partly because the stakes are too high to do anything else. And then, victory. October 1537. You give birth to Edward, a healthy, living, breathing boy. There's thunder in the streets, bells ringing for hours, and fireworks that light up the London sky. The king weeps. The country erupts in celebration. You've done it. You've achieved the impossible. And for the first time in a very long time, the Tudor court feels like a place of genuine joy. But not for long. The birth wasn't easy. You were in labour for 2 full days, and afterwards something's wrong. The bleeding won't stop. Fever sets in. The courtiers try to keep it quiet. After all, what kind of story would it be if the perfect wife, the sun-bearer, dies right after fulfilling her purpose? But rumours leak through the silk-lined walls like smoke. You're pale. Your eyes don't focus. They try herbs, poultices, prayers. Nothing works. 12 days after giving birth, you die. Quietly. In bed. Surrounded by people who don't quite know how to mourn you yet. Henry is devastated. Or at least that's what the chronicles say. He goes into seclusion, wears black for 3 months, and swears he will never remarry. Which, of course, lasts all of 3 years. But here's the twist. You become the favourite wife, the only one to give him a legitimate son, and the only one who didn't outlive his affection. You're buried beside him in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. None of the others get that honour. Your story seems almost peaceful compared to the ones before and after you. But let's not pretend it was easy. You had to be small, quiet, perfect, and even then, it killed you. They say childbirth was one of the leading causes of death for women in your time. But dying while royal? That just means you get a slightly better tomb. Your son, Edward VI, does become king, but only at age 9. He rules for 6 years before dying of illness, frail and hollowed by the same Tudor bloodline that chewed up all its queens. You don't get to see it, you don't get to raise him, you get your victory carved in marble, your memory used like a political mascot for future Protestant propaganda, and that's about it. Still, historians can't agree on you. Were you Henry's true love, or just his emotional rebound after the chaos of Anne? Some argue that he loved you most because you didn't live long enough to disappoint him. Others say you were a political pawn just like the rest, picked for your virtue, praised for your silence, and discarded by fate. You're the ideal Tudor queen because your death left no time for scandal. But here's the eerie part. While you fade into the sainted shadows of memory, Anne Boleyn's daughter is still out there, being raised far from court, absorbing the lessons of her mother's rise and fall. And eventually she'll face off with your son's throne. The seeds of that future are already planted. You're just not around to see them bloom. So yes, you die with a crown on your head and a prince in your arms. But if you think that makes your life less of a nightmare, think again. In Henry's world, even victory comes with a body count. You're Anne of Cleves, and this entire situation feels like a royal scam wrapped in velvet. You didn't even meet the guy before the wedding was arranged. No long courtship, no shared letters, just a portrait painted by Hans Holbein, where you look demure, calm, almost ethereal. It's a trap, obviously. Holbein's job wasn't accuracy, it was diplomacy with a brush, and he made you look like a porcelain angel. No one told you the English king was a moody, bloated tyrant on wife number 4 with a rapidly receding hairline and the emotional stability of a thunderstorm. You just figured you were marrying a king. That had to mean something, right? The truth is, you're a German princess, raised in a strict Lutheran household where girls aren't trained in courtly flirtation or Renaissance waltzing. You know how to sew, manage a household, and keep a straight face during uncomfortable silences. That's your charm. When the English envoys came to evaluate you, they were a little underwhelmed. But desperate times call for desperate matches. Henry needed an alliance with the German states, and you came with the right political packaging. So off you go, across the freezing channel, wrapped in furs, clueless about the hurricane you're sailing into. Henry, in all his romantic wisdom, decides to show up in disguise when you arrive in England. He sneaks into your chambers dressed like a courtier, expecting a spark of passion. Instead, you look confused and slightly horrified when this pudgy stranger tries to kiss you. He stomps away, humiliated. From that moment on, you're doomed. He declares you unattractive, calls you a Flanders mare, not exactly the kind of nickname that inspires poetry, but the wedding plans are already in motion, and Henry can't back out without creating a political mess. So on January 6th, 1540, you marry him. Unwillingly, lovelessly, but legally. The marriage is a disaster from the start. Henry doesn't even try to hide it. He complains to everyone, including his closest advisors and probably the kitchen staff, that he can't bring himself to consummate the marriage. You lie there each night in silence while he mumbles about how unready he is. Later he blames your body for his inability to perform. Classy. And yet, here's where it gets weird. You don't complain, you smile, you bow, you play along. Because deep down you understand something the other queens didn't quite grasp early enough. Sometimes survival means losing with grace. Within 6 months the annulment is announced. Henry claims the marriage was never valid because you weren't as hot as your portrait. The court expects outrage. Instead, you agree, cheerfully, publicly. You hand over the crown and wish Henry and his next victim the very best. It's the smoothest divorce in royal history, and for your incredible show of chill, you are rewarded. You get castles, lands, a hefty allowance, and a new title, the King's beloved sister. Which is weird, but honestly, you'll take it. No angry mobs, no tower, no executioner measuring your neck. You actually get invited to court events. You ride alongside the royal children. Even Mary and Elizabeth start treating you like family. Occasionally you're seated just a few feet from Henry himself, watching the drama unfold while sipping wine and silently high-fiving yourself for dodging the deadliest marriage in England. Meanwhile, the rest of the court spirals. Henry has moved on, again, this time to Catherine Howard, who is young enough to be your daughter, and the age gap. Let's just say the ink on your annulment papers is still wet when Henry starts parading her around like a trophy. You don't say a word. Why would you? You're alive, rich, and totally unbothered. But don't think you're entirely free. Court life is fickle. You still have to smile in the right rooms, flatter the right people, avoid making any political statements that could tie you back to your Protestant homeland. You're living in a gilded cage, sure, but it's still a cage. You get lonely. You miss your language, your customs. The English nobles think you're a bit odd. You know you're a joke in some circles, the one that got rejected. But unlike Anne Boleyn, you don't bleed for it. Unlike Catherine of Aragon, you aren't exiled for it. And unlike Jane Seymour, you actually get to enjoy your fortune for a while. Historians don't always know what to do with you. Some dismiss you as the irrelevant queen, the footnote. Others see you as the smartest of the six, the one who figured out that escaping alive was worth more than clinging to the crown. There's even some speculation that you and Henry got along better after the divorce than during the marriage. He respected you in his own weird, egotistical way. Maybe because you were the only wife who didn't make demands, or maybe because you never challenged his authority. You gave him exactly what he wanted, an exit strategy with no scandal. So while the rest of Henry's wives are remembered for their bloodshed, betrayal and tragedy, your story is a quiet escape route through the chaos. A reminder that sometimes the best way to win is to leave the game before the dice are even rolled. Your legacy? Peaceful, unremarkable perhaps, but also free. You outlive Henry. You outlive his next two wives. You even outlive his son. You die in your 60s, in your own bed, surrounded by servants and peace. And in Tudor England, that makes you practically a superhero. Now you're Catherine Howard, and the nightmare starts before your name is even printed on the marriage license. You're 17, maybe 16 depending on who's doing the math, and suddenly you're being handed over to a king in his late 40s who's overweight, foul-tempered, and nursing a festering leg wound that smells like rot and regret. You smile anyway. That's what you've been trained to do. You've been coached to be pretty, polished, flirtatious, and harmless. It's the only kind of power anyone's allowed to hand you, and now that performance has landed you a crown and a bullseye on your back. You come from the Howard family, a powerful but scandal-ridden clan with a long history of pushing their daughters into court like pawns on a chessboard. Your cousin, Anne Boleyn. You know how that turned out, but instead of caution, the Howards just see opportunity. If Anne failed, maybe you'll succeed. You're younger, more pliable, and most importantly still breathing. So they clean you up, throw a few pearls in your hair, and send you to charm a king who's looking for one last shot at youthful bliss. At first it works. Henry is delighted. He calls you his rose without a thorn, which is tragically ironic if you think about it for too long. He lavishes you with jewels, gowns, and ridiculous gifts that seem romantic until you realise he gave the exact same presents to his last wife. You act flattered anyway. You giggle. You dance. You do everything but scream. Because deep down you know this isn't love. It's survival. You're expected to play the perfect young bride to a man twice your age who can't walk without help. You whisper sweet nothings over the smell of his rotting leg, knowing full well that being honest would be fatal. But here's the twist. You're not as innocent as they think. Before the king, there were others. Henry Manox, Francis Derham. Boys you flirted with back when you were still cloistered in the Duchess of Norfolk's household. A kind of halfway house for noble girls who needed polishing. There were kisses. There were promises. And yes, there may have been more. But back then, you were a teenager, barely educated and left to roam the halls unsupervised while the adults sipped wine and ignored the gossip. Still, what happened before the crown was supposed to stay buried under corsets and silence, and it might have, except you make the fatal mistake of reaching back into your past while wearing a crown. You secretly hire Francis Derham to work in your household, trying to keep him quiet. But secrets, especially sexy ones, don't stay that way long in a palace where servants are always listening and enemies are always circling. And then there's Thomas Culpeper, young, handsome, and close to the king. You start passing him notes, private meetings, whispers in the hallways. Maybe it was love, maybe it was desperation, maybe it was just the need to feel like something in your world belonged to you. But it's enough to break the illusion of innocence. It's enough to get you killed. The rumours start small, just court gossip. But once they reach Archbishop Cranmer's ears, they turn into a full-blown investigation. Suddenly people are being questioned. Diaries are uncovered. Old letters resurface. Everyone who's ever known you is dragged into interrogation. And you? You're still smiling at court banquets, blissfully unaware that your world is about to collapse. When the charges finally come, they hit like a freight train. Adultery, treason, deceiving the king. You're arrested and confined to your chambers. At first, you think you can cry your way out of it. You beg for mercy, scribble letters to the king, throw yourself on the floor. You say you were young. You say you were foolish. You say you're sorry. But none of it matters. Not anymore. Your servants betray you. Your family distances themselves. The king, your sweet, adoring papa husband, turns cold. They say he weeps, not for love lost, but for pride wounded. He can't believe you dared to cheat on him, and worse, made him a laughingstock. He once called you perfect. Now he calls you poison. They take you to the Tower of London. You collapse upon arrival, sobbing and terrified. You don't walk with dignity. You scream. You beg. You're still just a teenager after all. And suddenly the weight of it, the mistakes, the lies, the sheer youth of it all, crushes you. The night before your execution, you ask for the block to be brought to your chamber. You want to practice laying your head on it. You don't want to embarrass yourself in front of the crowd. That's how broken you are. You're more worried about looking proper while dying than about dying itself. And when morning comes, February 13th, 1542, you step outside in the cold, dressed in black. Your final words. According to some, you say you die a queen, but would rather die the wife of Culpeper. According to others, you simply beg for mercy. Either way, your voice trembles. The axe falls. You're gone before your 20th birthday. Historians still debate your guilt. Was it adultery, or just the shadows of a messy adolescence? Were you truly unfaithful, or simply foolish in trusting the wrong people? Some argue you were exploited by your family, by the court, by Henry himself. Others blame your recklessness. The truth is likely tangled somewhere between all that. But what's undeniable is this. Being a young woman at Henry's court wasn't a privilege, it was a sentence. And as your blood soaks into the straw, somewhere in another chamber, Henry orders a feast. Now you're Catherine Parr, and by this point you've seen enough beheadings to develop a mild neckache just from anxiety. You know how the pattern goes. The king falls in love, the court swoons, the wife disappoints, the executioner sharpens his blade. And yet, here you are, wife number 6, smiling tightly and pretending this whole thing isn't one long bloody job interview with a trapdoor under your chair. You're not naive. You're also not particularly eager to marry a man who's roughly twice your age and famously murderous when emotionally inconvenienced. But saying no to Henry VIII isn't an option. You've seen what happens. You're already a widow. Twice, actually. First married at 17, then again in your 20s. You've done the whole obedient noblewoman routine. You've played nursemaid, manager, and even a little bit of political advisor. You're clever, educated, and fluent in the art of not making powerful men feel stupid. And just when you thought you might finally marry for love, Thomas Seymour, your dashing, politically savvy suitor, you get summoned by the king. You're now property of the crown. Hope you weren't attached to your freedom. The wedding is fast. Barely enough time to unpack your books before you're crowned queen, and expected to smile like you haven't just kissed goodbye your chance at happiness. Henry, meanwhile, is deep in decline. He's obese, diabetic, constantly in pain from his ulcerated leg, and prone to tantrums that would embarrass a toddler. You sleep in separate chambers, thank God, but you still have to play the role. The doting wife, the loyal companion, the endlessly understanding woman. Your day job, nursing a rotting king. Your side hustle, not getting murdered. But here's the thing, you're smart. Smarter than any of the other wives, honestly. While Henry obsesses over his war campaigns and dinner platters, you quietly build your influence. You reintroduce his children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward, back into the line of succession. You champion women's education. You even publish books under your own name, the first English queen to do so. Religious texts, mostly, written with that subtle blend of devotion and diplomatic ambiguity that won't get you labelled a heretic. Yet. Still, your interest in Protestantism makes enemies. Henry's court is full of old-school Catholics who want your head the minute you start talking about scripture like you actually understand it. One of your enemies, possibly Stephen Gardiner, the Bishop of Winchester, whispers in the king's ear. Suddenly there's a warrant for your arrest. The charge, heresy. You panic. This is it. You can almost hear the click of the axe locking into place. But instead of running or hiding, you do something brilliant. You grovel. You flatter Henry's ego so hard it's practically a full-body massage. You say you were only discussing religion to distract him from his pain, that you're just a woman after all, what could you possibly know? Henry, bloated with pride, eats it up like roast pheasant. He calls off the arrest. You live, just barely. After that, you keep a tighter grip on your tongue. You focus on safer pursuits, education, charity, and keeping the household from falling into chaos. You oversee the upbringing of Elizabeth, and it shows. The girl is whip-smart, observant, and already learning how to navigate men like stepping stones. You see yourself in her, sharp, careful, and one misstep away from disaster. When Henry finally dies in 1547, you don't cry. You probably feel relief, guilt, maybe a dash of survivor's guilt. You outlived him. You outmaneuvered him. You made it out of the Tudor royal grinder with your head still attached. And for a brief, glimmering moment, you taste freedom. You marry Thomas Seymour. Yes, the same charming man you had to abandon years earlier. But the fantasy doesn't last. Thomas turns out to be, well, Thomas. Ambitious, scheming, and creepily affectionate toward your teenage stepdaughter Elizabeth. You're pregnant now, which is a miracle and a risk. At your age, mid-30s by Tudor standards, it's almost a gamble with death. Still, you press on. You're finally building the life you dreamed about, and then it unravels. Childbirth comes fast and brutal. The labour leaves you shattered, and the infection sets in within days. Feverish, sweating, raving. You spend your final hours accusing Thomas of poisoning you, or maybe just of being himself. You die in September the 1548, 1 year after Henry. Your newborn daughter won't survive long either. It's a bleak end, made crueler by how close you came to escaping the nightmare. You almost made it, almost wrote your own chapter outside Henry's shadow. But in the end, the roles women are given in this world, queen, nurse, scholar, mother, are all equally suffocating when wrapped in royal expectations. Historians puzzle over your legacy. Some say you were the luckiest of the wives, the one who survived. Others point out the cost of that survival, constant vigilance, suppression of your voice, and a post-Henry life that turned toxic fast. You were clever, certainly. But even cleverness wasn't always enough. Still, there's something in your story that lingers. You didn't just endure the monster, you outlasted him. You helped shape the future queen. And that queen, she'll remember everything. Now step back. You're not a queen this time. You're something worse, a woman at court. Just a woman. Any woman. Maybe you're a lady-in-waiting, clutching a prayer book like a shield. Maybe you're a seamstress with calloused fingers and the unfortunate job of stitching morning gowns more often than wedding dresses. Or maybe you're a nobleman's daughter, paraded through the great halls like a potential offering to a god with gout. You watch the queens come and go, one prettier, younger, quieter, or occasionally louder than the last. They arrive with hope and leave with nothing but a name on the scaffold schedule, and you wonder every time what kind of nightmare you're all trapped in. Because by now, Henry isn't even pretending to be romantic. He's bloated, petulant, and impossible to please. His moods swing like church bells in a windstorm, booming one day with affection, then crashing the next with paranoid rage. He devours meat like a wolf, throws tantrums over the temperature of his wine, and snaps at counsellors with no warning. His leg stinks, open ulcers, rotting flesh, the smell wafting through chambers like a cursed perfume. And yet, he's still the most powerful man in the country. You smile at him. You bow. You thank him for the honour of being ignored. Being near Henry is like walking through a dry forest during a lightning storm. One wrong word, one sideways glance, one whisper taken the wrong way, and you're out. Banished, disgraced, or worse, arrested. Every woman knows this. Every noble family knows it too. And still, they push their daughters toward him like sacrificial lambs. Why? Because if she survives, if she gets wealth, land, influence, a place in the royal family tree, it's a gamble, the kind that makes your hands sweat. But here's what no one ever talks about. The day-to-day horror of simply existing near him. The royal mood swings aren't just infamous. They're weaponized. One moment he's laughing, quoting Latin at dinner. The next he's demanding the arrest of your cousin because someone whispered she was too Protestant. Everyone in court walks on tiptoe. You learn to memorise facial twitches, track the pace of his footsteps, decode sighs like secret messages. Did he grimace today because he's angry, or because his leg hurts? Did he frown because your gown is blue, or because it reminds him of Catherine of Aragon? You never know, so you smile wider and keep your mouth shut. If you serve one of the queens, it's worse. You're part of her household, which means if she falls, you might fall with her. The day Catherine Howard is arrested, you see her ladies-in-waiting dragged out too. Some are tortured, some vanish, some reappear months later with faces like wax statues. You learn quickly that friendship with a queen is no shield. It's a liability. And then there are the whispers, always the whispers, that so-and-so is in favour, that someone else has lost her looks, that the king has a new interest. You pretend not to hear because repeating gossip in this place can get you hauled into court for treason. Yes, treason. In Henry's England, saying a queen looks tired could be construed as suggesting she's infertile. And infertility, that's practically a death sentence. You start to hate the colour red, not for its brightness, but for its place in the executioner's wardrobe. You've seen it too many times, cloaked figures leading trembling women through stone corridors. The tower always looms in the distance, grey and hungry, swallowing women whole. You try not to look at it from the palace windows. Some say they can still hear Anne Boleyn's ghost in the hallways. You believe them. And yet somehow court life goes on. Balls are held, feasts are prepared, musicians play like the world isn't on fire. You dance. You laugh at the right moments. You accept compliments you didn't ask for. Because in this place, performance is protection. If you're lucky, maybe the king won't notice you at all. Still, you wonder what happens behind closed doors, what the queens look like when the curtains are drawn and no one is watching. Do they cry? Scream? Do they pace their chambers like animals in a cage? When Catherine Parr almost gets arrested for heresy, you hear the entire palace go silent. When she survives, the sigh of relief feels like thunder in reverse. You think of the girls who haven't been so lucky. Catherine Howard, so young, so foolish, so dead. Anne Boleyn, too clever by half. Jane Seymour, martyred by childbirth. Even Anne of Cleves, the one who survived, had to swallow her pride to do it. Each woman's story has become a cautionary tale told in terrified glances, and through all this Henry just keeps going. His wives are replaceable. His tantrums are eternal. But something in him is shifting. He's not the golden prince he once was. He doesn't ride anymore. He needs to be carried in special chairs. His eyes have dulled. His face sags. But his power, untouched, as strong and terrifying as ever. There are debates even now among historians. Was Henry always this cruel? Or did he decay into it, rotting alongside his own body? Did grief twist him? Did paranoia drive him mad? Or did absolute power just do what it always does? Strip a man of anything good he might have been? We'll never know. But you know how it feels to be in his world. You know the sound of a crown being passed like a curse from woman to woman. You know how to survive it, if barely. And when you finally leave court, if you ever do, you don't take souvenirs. Just silence, caution, and a memory of watching queens vanish like smoke. You keep your head down. You speak in whispers. You walk a little faster past the tower, because in Henry's court, even being a nobody is dangerous. You don't get to be queen. You're not even at court. You're just outside it, just far enough that your neck is safe, but close enough to feel the tremors. You hear the news before it becomes official. You hear it from your butcher, your neighbour, the monk at the abbey who speaks in hushed tones. Anne Boleyn has been arrested, charged with adultery, incest and treason. You blink. You know those charges are ridiculous. Everyone knows. But no one says a word louder than a whisper. That's the trick of it. Truth doesn't matter here. Not if the king decides otherwise. You're in the crowd that day. The tower looms above you, tall and grey against the May sky. The scaffold has been swept clean from the last execution, though the blood never really leaves. People gather early, clutching their children's hands, jostling for a better view. A woman beside you sells sweetmeats. Another murmurs prayers. You just stare, waiting, dreading. And then the door opens, and there she is, Anne Boleyn, queen no more. She steps onto the platform, not sobbing, not screaming, but composed. Too composed. She's wearing a grey gown, the kind that clings to dignity even in ruin. Her dark hair is tucked neatly under a linen cap, eyes fixed ahead, hands trembling only slightly. You can't believe she's real. Not long ago she was untouchable. Now she's about to die, and there's nothing anyone can do about it. The executioner, imported from France of course, waits quietly behind her. He's dressed all in black, holding his sword low. She kneels, whispers a few final words. "To Jesus Christ I commend my soul." You hear her voice, clear and calm. Not a queen, not a witch, not a traitor, just a woman. And then, without ceremony, the sword arcs through the air and takes her head cleanly from her shoulders. The silence that follows is unbearable. No one cheers. This isn't a celebration, it's a performance with a terrible ending. A few people cry, one child vomits. You just stand there, frozen, your hand clenched so tightly your nails draw blood in your palm. That's how real it is. That's how loud the lesson hits. If she can fall, anyone can. The court claims it was justice, that Anne was unfaithful with multiple men, including her own brother. The idea is absurd. But again, truth is irrelevant. Henry needed her gone. She had failed to give him a son, had grown too powerful, too outspoken. Worse, she had become inconvenient. And when a wife becomes inconvenient, the king doesn't wait. He destroys. Historians argue endlessly about Anne's guilt. There are those who insist she was framed, Thomas Cromwell pulling the strings to satisfy Henry's desire for a clean exit. Others think maybe she flirted too freely, that courtly affection blurred lines in ways that looked scandalous when magnified under paranoia. But the truth likely lies in a familiar place. She was too bold, too intelligent, too unwilling to bow low enough, and that more than any rumour signed her death warrant. You walk away from the tower with shaking legs and a stomach twisted in knots. All day, you think about her daughter, left behind, the flowers she used to wear in her hair, the way people used to bow to her in the street. You think about the power she held and how fragile it turned out to be. And then you think about the other wives, Catherine of Aragon, who withered in exile, Jane Seymour, who died in childbirth, Anne of Cleves, who narrowly dodged the axe by surrendering with a smile, Catherine Howard, young and doomed, Catherine Parr, alive for now. There's a pattern, and it's not subtle. Royal wives are royal targets. You wonder how the court keeps finding new women willing to play this game. You suppose most don't see it until they're already trapped. Back in the villages and towns beyond the palace, people talk, quietly, carefully. No one speaks ill of the king, but they mourn Anne in their own way. Some pray for her soul. Others paint her image on the corners of letters, small enough to go unnoticed. A few women tie a black ribbon around their necks, a silent show of solidarity. Because deep down everyone knows she wasn't the first woman destroyed by a powerful man. She won't be the last. Years later, her daughter, Elizabeth, will ascend to the throne. A red-haired girl who learned very young that crowns come with thorns, and silence can be louder than speeches. People say she inherits her mother's eyes, her wit, her sense of justice wrapped in calculation. She will reign longer than any Tudor before her and never marry. Historians love to argue about why, but maybe it's simple. Maybe she watched too many queens fall. As for you, you go home, you return to your chores, your prayers, your safe small life. But Anne's death lingers. The sound of the sword, the way she stood there, spine straight, even as the world turned its back on her. You'll never forget it. And next time the bells toll, you'll know what they mean. You've barely finished grieving the last queen when the bells start again. They're not tolling this time. They're clanging in celebration. Jane Seymour has given birth to a son. A son. England erupts like it just won the lottery because, let's face it, it kind of did. A legitimate male heir is the holy grail of Tudor politics, and Henry finally has his. You watch from the sidelines as the court explodes in music, parades, and drunken jubilation. Edward, that's his name. Edward Tudor, future king, saviour of the dynasty, living proof that maybe Henry isn't cursed after all. But there's a shadow over the joy. Jane is missing. Not at the celebrations, not posing proudly with her child, not appearing in the chapel to offer thanks, because Jane is dying, or rather Jane is already dead. The court just hasn't officially processed it yet. She survived the childbirth, technically, but not the aftermath. The fever came fast, relentless, and within 12 days she was gone. Whispers circle that she never got out of bed after the birth, that she held Edward once, maybe twice, then faded like candlelight in a cold room. Henry for once actually seems shattered, or at least deeply inconvenienced. He retreats from court, cancels festivities, dons black. Some say he truly loved her. Others say he loved what she gave him. Either way, he has her body embalmed, laid to rest in white satin, and buried with all the ceremony of a saint. And later, when he dies, he'll request to be buried beside her, the only wife who gets that honour. Not Catherine of Aragon, his first and most loyal. Not Anne Boleyn, the woman he changed the entire church for. Not even the wife who survives him. Number Jane, the quiet one. Jane, who didn't outlive his affection. Jane, who died before things got complicated. You wonder what would have happened if she'd lived. Would she have become another pawn, another queen fading beneath royal disapproval and pressure? Would she have kept Henry's favour? Or would she have become a footnote like so many others, remembered more for what she failed to do than for what she achieved? Some historians argue she would have had a stronger political role, that her moderate temperament might have brought some peace to Henry's volatile court. But peace is a foreign language in this world. You doubt it would have lasted. The court spins again, like a carousel powered by anxiety and desperation. Jane's death doesn't slow the machinery, it only shifts it. Suddenly there's pressure to find a new queen, a caretaker for Edward, a soothing female presence to calm the king's temper and give the public something to cheer about. Ambassadors begin to whisper about eligible princesses across Europe, sending portraits like Tinder profiles with extra religious baggage. And amid all this, the memory of Jane becomes something sacred. Her image is carefully curated, pure, devout, obedient. The perfect queen, the perfect mother, the perfect woman, because she didn't live long enough to contradict anyone. Even her voice gets erased. You don't know what she truly thought, because no one bothered to record it. All that remains are eulogies written by men who needed her to symbolise something. Fertility, obedience, peace. Take your pick. At court, a small shrine of sorts grows in her memory. Not literal, of course, no candles or relics, but her name is spoken with a kind of reverence that makes the other wives seem toxic by comparison. Henry uses her ghost like armour. When critics bring up Anne Boleyn or complain about the king's new policies, someone always brings Jane into the conversation. His heart still grieves, they say. He hasn't been the same since her passing. It works, for a while. But grief doesn't change Henry. If anything, it hardens him further. He's aging poorly. His leg, once just an annoyance, is now a festering wound. He can barely walk. His waistline has ballooned to the size of a wine barrel, and his temper has followed suit. He isolates himself more and more, emerging only to rage at council, meetings, or to glare at artists painting his ever less flattering portraits. When he does appear in public, it's with fanfare designed to distract from the fact that he's being carted around like furniture. Still, Edward is growing, pale, delicate, but sharp. Tutors flood the nursery with Latin, theology, and court etiquette. The boy barely sees his father, but the crown above his cradle is heavy enough to crush anything soft within him. And surrounding Edward are women, nannies, nurses, governesses, none of whom can claim to be queen. That vacancy echoes through the halls, cold and unfinished. Meanwhile, the memory of Jane is used like a scalpel, sharp, strategic. When Anne of Cleves is introduced to the king, Jane's memory becomes a measuring stick she cannot possibly meet. When Catherine Howard is elevated, Jane is invoked again, a ghost standing in silent judgment of her teenage replacement. And later, when Catherine Parr arrives, Jane becomes a tool of comparison. This one's clever, but Jane was kind. This one's Protestant, but Jane was pious. Jane becomes the queen all others must fail to live up to. You realise something chilling. In Henry's court, dead wives are often more useful than living ones. They don't speak. They don't defy. They don't disappoint. They can be shaped into whatever the narrative demands. And Jane Seymour, the wife who gave him what he wanted and died before she could do anything else, becomes the perfect blank canvas. So while the court moves on, new queens, new crises, new scandals, Jane's memory is preserved like a saint's relic. A body that was once warm and frightened and possibly even opinionated, now reduced to an idea. an ideal. And you, standing quietly in the outer circle of this madness, realise the nightmare doesn't end with death. Sometimes it's only just beginning. By now, you're used to the rhythm of it. The royal court moves like a snake shedding its skin, each queen a fresh layer, stripped and replaced when the mood sours. Jane Seymour is gone, sanctified and buried, her image polished smooth by the flattering hands of memory. But the king, still alive, still dangerous, still looking. And now attention turns outward again, to Europe, to diplomacy, to another portrait. This time it's a German princess named Anne of Cleves, and you can already feel the collective court eyebrow raising. Another foreign queen? Another arranged marriage based on a flattering brushstroke and a prayer? Here we go again. Henry's advisers, scrambling to strengthen England's Protestant alliances, nudge Anne forward like a strategic chess move. Her brother leads the Protestant League, handy if you're trying to keep the Pope at arm's length, but there's a problem. Henry's first glance at her isn't through the lens of statecraft, it's through the hole in a disguise, literally. He dresses up like a peasant and barges into her chambers, expecting a fairy tale reaction. She doesn't recognise him, doesn't swoon, doesn't offer a carefully rehearsed curtsy. Instead, she looks startled, maybe even unimpressed. Big mistake. Henry is insulted. No, he's humiliated. And because his ego is as fragile as his leg is infected, that moment colours everything that follows. The marriage proceeds because at this point it's too diplomatically messy to back out. But his heart, not in it. His loins, also not in it, if we're being brutally honest. The wedding night is a disaster. He tells his courtiers that he couldn't perform, says she smells wrong, says her body isn't appealing. He calls her a Flanders mare, which sounds like a barnyard insult because it is. But here's where Anne pulls the ultimate move. She doesn't argue, doesn't cry, doesn't rage against the unfairness of it. She agrees with him, publicly, cheerfully. "You're right," she says. "We were never really married in spirit." She signs the annulment papers, surrenders the crown, and walks away with a grin and a very generous settlement. And just like that, she becomes the only ex-wife Henry doesn't hate. In fact, he kind of likes her, starts calling her his sister, invites her to court, gives her estates. She attends Christmas feasts, chats with his daughters, laughs with his future wives. She dodged not only a king's disappointment, but the death that usually follows. And she did it with a smile so practiced you'd think she rehearsed it since childhood. You watch her at these events, always dressed finely, always seated close enough to remind people she's still around, but never close enough to be threatening. She never speaks ill of Henry, never tries to reclaim her title. Instead, she becomes the only woman in his life who manages to make it through without a breakdown, a beheading, or a burial. And that alone? That makes her legendary. But you also know it wasn't luck. Anne of Cleves read the room better than anyone. She understood that arguing with Henry was like wrestling a bear with gout. Ugly, loud, and definitely fatal. She kept her head not by fighting, but by yielding at precisely the right moment. And in doing so, she outlasted the marriage, outlasted the scandal, and, eventually, outlasted the king. Historians, of course, love to debate whether Anne was clever or just conveniently pliable. Some claim she was smarter than she let on, that her public humility masked a shrewd instinct for survival. Others say she was simply lucky, picked up, inspected, and set back down without being broken. But the result speaks for itself. She walked away with land, money, and freedom. In Henry's world, that's a royal flush. You start to notice how Anne exists in this strange liminal space. Not queen, not disgraced, not quite honoured, but not disrespected either. People at court talk about her in lowered voices, unsure whether to mock her accent or praise her diplomacy. She's both a cautionary tale and an example to follow. Don't be too pretty. Don't be too plain. Don't speak too much, but don't be silent. Be foreign, but not too foreign. Most importantly, if the king wants out, let him, and take the castle with you. Meanwhile, Henry barrels forward. His body is failing, but his will remains tyrannical. He's planning yet another wedding. And Anne? She's watching. You imagine her sipping wine, watching the next bride-to-be with a faint, knowing smile. She doesn't warn her. What would be the point? Every queen thinks she'll be different. Every queen thinks she can love him into gentleness, but Anne knows better. Years later, when Henry is gone, Anne continues her strange afterlife as a half-remembered figure in court. She attends Elizabeth I's coronation. She nods, smiles, and fades into the background once again. And when she dies, at age 41, she leaves behind one of the few legacies in Henry's story that doesn't end in ruin. You think of all the wives, the ones who stayed too long, the ones who dared too much, the ones who loved him sincerely and paid the price. And then you think of Anne of Cleves, who walked away with her neck intact, her estate secure, and somewhere inside a quiet, private smirk. In this game, survival isn't about being right. It's about knowing when not to play. The court feels different now, heavier, like it's holding its breath. Catherine Howard's death has chilled even the most seasoned courtiers. The laughter has dulled. The music sounds hollow. And though the great halls are still draped in velvet and flickering candlelight, it all seems like a cover for something rotting underneath. But Henry, well, Henry is Henry. Not even a teenager's execution slows his appetite for companionship. It's not long before you start hearing murmurs of a new woman in his orbit. And no, it's not a princess this time. It's not even someone particularly ambitious. It's a widow, a quiet one, with brains, Catherine Parr. You'd expect someone who's watched 5 queens disappear into disgrace, madness, or graves to steer clear of Henry VIII. But Catherine Parr is different. She's a survivor, and not just in the royal sense. She's buried 2 husbands already. She's managed estates, balanced books, and read more religious texts than most bishops. She's clever without being arrogant, pious without being preachy, and somehow still capable of smiling like she hasn't lived through a lifetime of grief. When the king proposes, she hesitates. Everyone sees it. She doesn't blush. She doesn't swoon. She calculates. Because marrying Henry VIII isn't romance. It's Russian roulette with crowns. But she says yes. Not because she wants to. Because she knows it's safer than saying no. You watch her enter court life with the quiet grace of someone who's already rehearsed every possible ending. She becomes Queen number 6 in 1543, and right away it's clear she's playing a longer game. She takes an interest in Henry's children, especially Elizabeth, who instantly attaches herself to her like a shadow. Catherine encourages their education, introduces them to scholars, and even starts hosting small theological debates over dinner. But she's careful, always careful, because deep down she knows that Henry loves a smart woman only when her intellect doesn't get in the way. Still, she can't help herself. She's passionate about faith, about the Reformation, about the idea that women should be able to read the Bible and interpret it themselves, and that unfortunately makes her a threat. The court is divided between reformers and traditionalists, and Catherine has started to lean too far in one direction. A warrant for her arrest is drafted. You hear it whispered through the corridors like a ghost. Heresy. The very word hisses like venom. People start backing away from her in hallways. The king grows cold, distant. But she doesn't panic. She pivots. When confronted, she says her religious discussions were only meant to distract the king from his chronic pain. That she's just a woman after all. Simple, devoted, too humble to claim any real theological insight. It's textbook submission, and it works. Henry softens. The warrant disappears, and Catherine lives to see another sunrise. You can't decide if that moment makes her brilliant or tragic. Maybe both. Her survival depends entirely on pretending to be less than she is. Every step, every word must be measured. Her intellect weaponized only when it's safely disguised as devotion. She becomes a master of this performance, not because she wants power, but because she wants to stay alive. And yet, in private, she still pushes boundaries. She writes and publishes a book, prayers or meditations, under her own name. The first English queen to do so. She advocates for education, for religious reform, quietly but persistently. She teaches Elizabeth that knowledge is power. That language is a sword you can hide in plain sight. And Elizabeth listens, closely, because she's already seen what happens to women who aren't careful. Catherine Parr's role becomes 1 part queen, 1 part nurse, and 1 part diplomat. She bandages Henry's leg, manages his moods, keeps the court spinning, and when he travels she's left in charge, a sign of trust or perhaps just exhaustion on his part. Either way, she holds the reins without letting anyone know she's steering. That's her gift. She rules without ruling. By now, Henry is falling apart, his body bloated, his mind increasingly paranoid. His children are growing, Mary, Elizabeth and young Edward, the precious heir who still coughs too much. Catherine juggles all of them. She tries to keep peace between the siblings, between the factions, between the dying king and the court ready to eat itself the moment he stops breathing. And then, in 1547, he does. Henry VIII dies, bloated and bedbound, muttering orders and absolutions to the very end. You'd think there'd be fireworks, but the moment is strangely quiet. His death is announced with careful choreography. Mourning clothes are distributed, bells toll, and behind it all the country sighs, not in grief, but in collective nervous anticipation. What now? Catherine Parr is finally free. For the first time in years, she can breathe without checking her words, her step, her pulse. But she doesn't retreat into obscurity. She remarries, this time for love, or what she thinks is love. Thomas Seymour, that charming, ambitious political peacock, swoops in fast. Too fast. Within weeks of Henry's death, they're engaged, scandalous, disrespectful. But Catherine doesn't care. She's survived worse. Only, this time the danger isn't royal. It's personal. Thomas is reckless, ambitious, flirtatious, especially with Elizabeth, who's still just a teenager living in Catherine's household. You hear rumours, they all do, that Thomas is getting a little too comfortable with the future queen, that Catherine walks in on moments that twist her stomach into knots, but she doesn't banish him, doesn't confront Elizabeth. She tries to hold the threads together, hoping it will pass. Then she finds herself pregnant. Finally, after years of widowhood, queenship, survival, she's carrying a child. It should be a celebration. But Catherine is older now, her body tired, and childbirth is always a gamble, especially for women who've lived long enough to understand what they're risking. She gives birth in 1548, a daughter, but infection sets in fast. Fever grips her. She begins to spiral. Some say she blames Thomas, others say she raves, incoherent. Within days, she's dead. Not on a scaffold, not exiled, not disgraced, just quietly extinguished, like so many women of her time, by the slow violence of childbirth. You stand there, absorbing her story, and you realise she may have outlived the king, but not the nightmare. So now you're standing at a court that's missing something, namely, a king. Henry VIII is dead. Finally. The monster has stopped thrashing, his leg wound no longer oozing its way into every room, his voice no longer booming orders laced with venom. You'd think it would feel like spring breaking through a long, bitter winter. But instead, it feels like walking through a crumbling cathedral. Grand, haunted, and completely unstable. Because even with Henry gone, the chaos he left behind is very much alive. Edward VI is king now, and if that name doesn't ring many bells, it's because he doesn't get the chance to build much of a legacy. He's only 9 when he takes the throne, and everyone around him knows it. The real rulers are the men behind him, regents, uncles, ambitious nobles playing power games in his name. Catherine Parr is dead. Jane Seymour is a saint in stone. The other wives are either erased or remembered only in rumours, and the country is beginning to wobble, under the weight of their collective ghosts. But there's one woman whose memory still looms large, and strangely she's the one who got rejected on sight. Anne of Cleves, the one called a Flanders mare. You'd think she'd vanish into the footnotes of history, a joke between more tragic chapters. But somehow she's still here. Not physically, she dies in 1557, but her story lingers in the background like a quiet lesson no one wants to talk about. Play the game just enough, then leave before it eats you. She never remarried, never returned to Germany. She stayed in England, tucked into estates given as compensation for her annulment. You'd see her at court function sometimes, dressed richly but never overly adorned, like someone who knows too much to draw attention. She was careful, always careful. She smiled just enough, nodded in the right places, and kept herself firmly out of the gossip mill. She was, by far, the most peaceful of all Henry's wives, and the one most frequently underestimated, and it all started with a portrait. Holbein's painting of her was the original Tinder catfish. Too flattering, some say, too vague. But others argue that Anne looked exactly as she always did. Henry just expected something she never promised. The portrait became infamous, blamed for a marriage that barely lasted 6 months. But the real issue was never her face, it was her mind. She wasn't seductive, she wasn't docile, and worst of all, she didn't panic when the king turned on her. She smiled, bowed, and walked away with money, land, and her life. Most queens don't get a retirement plan. Anne did. When Henry annulled their marriage, she didn't contest it. She didn't write angry letters or beg for pity. She agreed, graciously. And in return, she was granted estates in Kent and Richmond, a generous income, and the absurdly diplomatic title of the king's beloved sister. The irony of that label wasn't lost on anyone, but Anne wore it with quiet dignity. When court drama surged, she wasn't in the thick of it. When queens were crowned and then toppled, she simply sent her regards. She'd seen enough to know that attention from the king was like standing too close to a bonfire. You might be warm for a moment, but eventually you're going to burn. You still remember seeing her at Prince Edward's christening. Jane Seymour's child, raised like a relic of the Tudor dream. Anne was seated far from the royal cradle, but close enough to be noticed. She smiled politely, hands folded, the picture of composure. It was a masterclass in quiet triumph. Everyone else had been punished for being too much, too loud, too clever, too passionate. Anne had survived by being just enough. But don't confuse that with weakness. Anne was fluent in political manoeuvring. She may have lacked English polish when she arrived, but she quickly adapted. She learned the language, embraced English fashion, maintained good relationships with Henry's children, especially Elizabeth and Mary. She navigated a minefield of egos and still managed to die of natural causes, not execution or exile. That's not luck, that's skill. Historians still argue whether Anne was Henry's biggest mistake or his quietest success. Some insist the marriage was doomed from the start because she and Henry had no chemistry. Others say the king's ego couldn't handle a woman who didn't fall all over him. But what no one disputes is this: Anne won. She was handed a political grenade and defused it without losing a finger. You think back to the other wives, and it's hard not to compare. Catherine of Aragon fought too hard for dignity and died alone. Anne Boleyn burned too brightly and was snuffed out. Jane Seymour succeeded, but at the cost of her life. Catherine Howard was too young to understand the rules. Catherine Parr outlived Henry, only to die from childbirth and betrayal. But Anne of Cleves? She sidestepped the trap entirely. Her legacy is quieter but strangely modern. She's the woman who saw what Henry was and decided, without fanfare or self-destruction, that he wasn't worth the fight. And in a world that demanded women either submit or suffer, Anne did something radical. She endured. Even after her death, her story echoes. You hear it in the conversations whispered at court, in the letters passed between ladies-in-waiting, in the curious glances of young women studying portraits, wondering if they could ever survive what Anne did. And when Elizabeth becomes queen, you notice she never marries. She knows the danger too well. Maybe Anne taught her that survival isn't about being adored, it's about knowing when to let go. Anne was never crowned, never mourned as a queen, never celebrated in stained glass or romanticised in Shakespearean tragedies. But she also never knelt before an executioner, and sometimes that's the only legacy you need. It's hard to keep track of the wives after a while. They blend together like half-remembered dreams, some tragic, some terrifying, some gone before anyone really knew them. But then there's Catherine Howard. You remember her vividly because her rise was too fast and her fall was too loud. She was a comet streaking across the court sky, blazing, brief and over, before she knew she was in danger. Now, she's dust. The court has shifted again, gone quiet for a while, like everyone's holding their breath between disasters. But it never stays silent for long, and into that hush steps someone unexpected. Catherine Parr, Queen number 6. The room changes when she enters, not because she's radiant or young, she's neither by court standards, but because she carries herself like someone who's already survived more than she should have, which to be fair, she has. Twice widowed, quietly intelligent, politically cautious, Catherine Parr is the kind of woman you'd trust with your secrets, but never underestimate. She isn't walking into the throne room to swoon at Henry's feet. She's walking in to survive him. The marriage is quick. Henry's health is crumbling. His leg wound has become a walking infection. He spends more time in bed than on the throne. barking orders between spoonfuls of meat and bursts of paranoia. His mood swings are even sharper now, shorter fuses, longer grudges. Catherine steps into this decaying storm not as a love interest, but as a caretaker with a crown, and she's good at it. Too good. She nurses him, she counsels him, she reads to him when his eyesight fails, she manages the palace while he barks at nobles and dreams of battle glories he'll never see again. And at night, she closes her door and prays, not just for his health, but for her own safety. Because even now, at this late stage, a wrong word can still mean a trip to the Tower. And it almost does. Catherine is deeply religious, Protestant specifically. She believes in reform, in scripture for all, in women reading and thinking for themselves, and for a while, Henry seems to tolerate it, even indulge it. He lets her publish a devotional book. He praises her intelligence in public. But then, just as quickly, his tolerance thins. Whispers reach his ears that Catherine is overstepping, that she's trying to sway him theologically, that she's challenging his authority. One night, she discovers there's a warrant for her arrest. Heresy. That word again. The one that doesn't come with a fine or a warning. It comes with a scaffold. Catherine doesn't panic. She plays the only card left. Submission. She tells Henry she never meant to teach, only to distract him from his pain. That she's just a simple woman, a devoted wife, harmless. He buys it. The warrant disappears. She lives. But that brush with death leaves a mark. She starts pulling back, keeping her thoughts closer, her reforms quieter. She still educates, still writes, but with more caution, less fire. The Queen, who wanted to uplift women, now spends her energy staying alive long enough to outlive the King. She succeeds. When Henry dies in 1547, Catherine finally exhales. It's not celebration. It's not relief. It's just the end of a long, grueling war she had to pretend wasn't happening. And after years of being the last woman standing, she finally makes a choice for herself. She marries for love, or what she thinks is love. Thomas Seymour, charming and ambitious, full of flattery and dangerous ideas. For a moment she believes she's escaped the nightmare. But if you've been paying attention, you already know. Peace doesn't last. Their marriage is scandalous. Fast. Secretive. Catherine is supposed to be in mourning, not planning a honeymoon. But people overlook it, mostly because they're distracted by the new king, Edward VI, a child propped up by regents and infighting. Catherine sets up her own household, takes in young Elizabeth, and tries to build something like a real family. And for a flicker of time, it almost works. Then she gets pregnant. It should be good news. It isn't. She's in her mid-30s, which in Tudor math might as well be 75. The pregnancy is hard. The labour is worse. The delivery breaks her. And as the fever rises, so does her paranoia. She accuses Thomas of betrayal, of poison, of everything she's been too tired to say until now. Within days, she's dead. Her daughter, little Mary Seymour, vanishes from the records a few years later. Maybe she died in childhood. Maybe she was quietly tucked away in a convent or a cousin's estate. No one knows. No one asks. Because Catherine's story, like so many of Henry's wives, ends in the same echoing silence. Historians still try to define her. Some call her the survivor. Others label her Henry's nurse, his political equal, his forgotten queen. Some praise her intellect. Others reduce her to her final role as a mother who didn't make it. But one thing is clear. She understood the game better than almost anyone who played it. Catherine Parr didn't win by being sweet or beautiful or submissive. She won by calculating risk, by knowing when to speak and when to shrink. She outlived the king, shaped the early lives of future monarchs, and wrote her own words in a time when most women were only written about. And even though her final act was tragic, her legacy isn't. Because one of the girls she raised, the quiet red-haired one, was watching everything, and she was taking notes. You're Elizabeth now, but not the Queen, not yet, not even close. You're just the girl no one talks about too loudly. The daughter of a disgraced queen, the ghost of Anne Boleyn's ambition wrapped in red gold hair and an unreadable expression. People call you the bastard, behind closed doors anyway. Publicly they smile, bow, and pretend they don't smell the fear around you. You're 13, clever, and completely aware that every room you enter is bristling with memories of your mother's execution. You walk through court like it's made of glass, careful with every glance, every word, every breath. After Henry dies, things don't magically become safer. In fact, the chaos ramps up. Your younger brother Edward is king now, and though he's still learning how to hold a quill properly, grown men scramble over each other to control him. You're shuttled off to your own little household, a decorative royal sibling to be seen but not heard. And that's fine. You don't want attention. You've seen what attention does to women in this family, but the quiet doesn't last. Catherine Parr, your former stepmother and the closest thing you've had to stability, remarries Thomas Seymour. Too fast, too secretively, and entirely too soon after the king's death. You're sent to live in their household, and that's where things get complicated. Thomas is handsome, charming, and far too comfortable with you. At first, it's playful. Morning, tickles, jokes, overly affectionate smiles. But you're no fool. You know when a man is playing with fire. The real problem is that Catherine either doesn't see it, or she chooses not to. Maybe she thinks love will change him. Maybe she's just tired of fighting. Either way, you're left to figure it out on your own. You start avoiding him, locking your chamber door, watching your words, and when Catherine finally realises what's going on, you're sent away. Not with punishment, but with careful, calculated distance. It feels like exile, even if it's dressed up as decorum. Catherine dies not long after, childbirth of course, and you're left to carry the weight of everything unspoken. You learn the lesson fast. In this world, you don't get to be a child. Not if you're royal, not if you're a girl, especially not if you're Anne Boleyn's daughter. So you grow sharper, quieter. Every book becomes a weapon, every tutor a tool. You dive into Latin, Greek, history, theology. Not because you're trying to be exceptional, but because being unremarkable is dangerous. The only way to survive is to make yourself indispensable but invisible, fascinating but unthreatening. You walk the edge between obedience and independence like a tightrope strung over the Thames. Mary, your older half-sister, doesn't trust you. She sees your mother in your eyes, and when Edward dies, the kingdom is on the brink of tearing itself apart. For a moment it tilts toward Lady Jane Grey, poor girl, manipulated and sacrificed in record time. You keep your head down. When Mary finally claims the throne, you act as if it's the only outcome you ever wanted. You nod, you smile, you attend Mass even though you lean Protestant. You write letters that say nothing but mean everything. But Mary's rule is shaky, built on burnings and suspicion. She wants a Catholic England, a Spanish alliance, and no competition. You're all three of her worst nightmares. People are already whispering about you. How you look like your mother, how you speak with the same conviction, how you're unmarried and intelligent and far too composed for someone your age. You're not trying to take the throne. Not yet. But you don't have to. The crown is already inching toward you like a guilty secret. Then you're arrested. The Tower again. It always comes back to the Tower. You step into the same stone walls where your mother spent her last days, where Catherine Howard screamed before her execution, where men were tortured for treason and women wept into the bricks. You're questioned, interrogated, pushed for confessions you don't have. You say nothing that can be used. You pace, you pray, you don't sleep. And when they finally release you, because there's not quite enough evidence, you walk out a little thinner, a little harder, and a lot more dangerous. You're never safe again. Not really, but you learn to move through danger like a shadow. When Mary dies in 1558, childless and exhausted, the court turns to you. Not with joy, with resignation. You're next. You've always been next, and now it's your turn. The coronation is a spectacle. Gold and roses, trumpets and prayers, but underneath it all you can feel the eyes watching, waiting. Some expect you to fail, others hope you will, and you smile. You give them what they want, grace, power, mystery, but you give it on your terms. You never marry. People ask, they beg. Foreign princes write love letters packed with diplomacy. You entertain a few offers, let the rumours swirl and then let them rot. You saw what marriage did to your mother. You saw what it did to all of them. You don't need a husband. You are the crown. Historians will call you Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the woman who led England through a golden age of art, exploration, and naval supremacy. But you'll always know what your reign really is. Survival, with style. An entire life lived inside a storm you never allowed to touch you. And yes, sometimes you remember the other queens. not as role models, but as warnings. Catherine of Aragon's endurance, Anne Boleyn's spark, Jane Seymour's sacrifice, Anne of Cleves' escape, Catherine Howard's ruin, Catherine Parr's calculated grace. You carry them with you, not in sentiment, but in strategy, because you, Elizabeth, are the final girl. But you don't have to be Elizabeth to see it. The way the court never really recovers from what Henry did. His reign might be over, sealed in stone and buried under layers of gilded eulogy, but the aftershocks rattle through every brick of Whitehall, every whispered conversation in the corridors, every alliance weighed on a scale of fear. It's like the air itself remembers. You can taste it, the iron tang of blood still clinging to the wood grain of the scaffold. The people may bow to a new queen now, but the ghosts haven't gone anywhere. And neither has the formula he created. Because if there's one thing Henry VIII left behind more enduring than his waistline or his son's short reign, it's this twisted blueprint of royal love. Love as performance, marriage as survival, women as vessels and liabilities all in one breath. That's the real monster he gave the world. Not just the broken bodies of his wives, but the legacy that turned intimacy into a political battlefield and wives into war spoils. If you're a woman at court now, even under Elizabeth's watch, you still play by rules Henry invented. Flirt too much? You're Anne Boleyn. Flirt too little? Anne of Cleves. Too pious? Catherine of Aragon. Too sexual? Catherine Howard. Too ambitious? Catherine Parr. Too passive? Jane Seymour. Pick your poison. There's no right way to be a queen, only quicker or slower ways to fall, and yet people still line up to try. The court gossips keep spinning their endless web, pulling threads from every new scandal and tragedy. Someone swears they saw Elizabeth meeting with a foreign envoy alone. Was it a marriage proposal? A plot? Is she hiding a lover in the cellars of Richmond Palace? People can't stop looking for a man to pin to her, because no one knows what to do with a woman who rules alone and isn't trying to die for it. But Elizabeth knows better. She saw what marriage cost her mother, what silence cost Catherine Howard, what devotion cost Jane Seymour, and now she uses all of it, her memory, her trauma, her lineage, like a finely honed blade. The rumours, the expectations, the nagging from her counsellors to marry and produce an heir, she lets them hang in the air like smoke, distracting, thick, enough to make people forget where the fire actually is. Still, her refusal to marry becomes its own obsession. Suitors come and go, Philip of Spain, the Duke of Anjou, Robert Dudley. Each one gets their moment, their portrait in the mental slideshow of almosts. But Elizabeth never says yes. She strings them along just long enough to get what she wants, alliances, trade deals, breathing room, and then lets them go. It's political ballet at its finest. And somewhere, you have to believe Anne Boleyn would be proud, or at least a little impressed. That's not to say Elizabeth is immune to everything. She's not. Her court still functions like a drama set on fast forward. Jealousy blooms in every darkened hallway. Ambition hangs on every velvet curtain. Even her closest allies can't always be trusted. But Elizabeth doesn't need trust. She needs distance, and she keeps just enough of it to stay in control. Just enough to ensure no one ever gets close enough to pull her down the way Henry pulled down her mother. The scholars debated endlessly. Was Elizabeth traumatized into celibacy? Was it political genius? Was she incapable of love, or just smart enough to know love was a trap in her world? The truth is probably all of it, tangled together in a web of fear, pride, and ruthless memory. She learned young that love, at least the kind Henry offered, was never safe. And maybe she didn't want safety anyway. Maybe she wanted something bigger. Maybe survival wasn't enough. Maybe she wanted legacy. And she gets it. Not by being a wife, but by being something no wife was ever allowed to be. Whole, untamed, entirely her own. But back in the lesser chambers of court, among the maids and pages and ladies in waiting, the myth of Henry VIII's marriage gauntlet still lingers like mildew. Every young woman still wonders if she'll be chosen, if she'll be noticed, if she'll be elevated, or if she'll be the next body carried out behind a curtain of lies. They still talk in code, still marry strategically, still know the difference between a glance and a warning. Because even though Henry's dead, the culture he created isn't. Every woman at court still walks in the shadow of that throne. Every marriage is still a gamble, every flirtation a risk. The executioner's block is tucked away in a storeroom now, but its memory is fresher than the linen in the royal bed. You've seen how fast love turns into leverage. You know how fast affection becomes accusation, and no one forgets what happened to those 6 women. Their names are still whispered like cautionary tales, their fates recited like hymns to remind everyone what's at stake. Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. It sounds like a children's rhyme now, a catchy way to summarise the carnage. But if you listen closely, there's no comfort in it, just statistics. A roster of broken lives lined up like dominoes under the weight of one man's desire for control, disguised as divine right. And what about Henry? He got what he wanted, a son, a legacy, an empire held together by force and fire. But even that slipped through his fingers. Edward died at 15. Mary ruled briefly, her reign defined by executions and unrest. Only Elizabeth succeeded. Only she made something enduring, and she did it without him, which might be the most poetic revenge of all. Let's rewind a little, just far enough to remember that this nightmare didn't begin with 6 wives and a rotten leg. It started with a boy king who wasn't supposed to be king. Henry VIII wasn't born heir to the throne. That was Arthur, his older brother, the golden boy, the original prince. Arthur was smart, well-groomed for rule, and politically primed to link England with the mighty Spanish crown through his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. It was all going perfectly, until Arthur died. And suddenly, the entire kingdom was stuck with the backup plan. Young, athletic second son Henry, the spare turned heir. It's worth remembering this because it tells you something important. Henry was never supposed to carry this weight, and maybe he never quite got over that. Maybe he spent his entire reign trying to prove he deserved the crown that was handed to him by a cough in a cold chamber. When he became king at 17, it all looked like a storybook. He was tall, charming, fit, educated. He composed music, jousted like a champion, even wrote theological pamphlets defending Catholicism. He was called a second Solomon by the flatterers, a new Alexander. It's hard to picture this golden boy turning into the bloated tyrant we now recognise from every TV drama and dusty museum bust. But that transformation didn't happen overnight. It took years, wives, wars, frustrations, and a growing desperation that twisted love into power and power into paranoia. You wonder if it started with Catherine of Aragon. Not her as a person, she was devout, regal, endlessly patient, but with what she couldn't give him, a son. That failure, and it wasn't really hers, but let's be real, he wasn't looking in a mirror, began to chip away at Henry's image of control. The longer he went without a male heir, the more he spiralled, because deep down, this was never just about family. It was about legacy, about immortality, about not being the spare anymore. The first cracks appear when Henry tries to divorce Catherine. The Pope says no, so Henry creates his own church. Not a small move. That's the moment where the shift really happens, where love officially turns into policy. You don't just break a marriage, you break Europe to do it. Anne Boleyn is the spark, but the fire is something bigger. Henry wants a dynasty that can't be questioned, and that obsession becomes the blueprint for everything that follows. Each marriage after that is a patch job on a sinking hull. Anne gives him a daughter, not a son. Jane gives him the son, but dies. Anne of Cleves is a diplomatic misfire. Catherine Howard is lust and delusion. Catherine Parr is strategy and survival. Each one solves a short-term problem and creates a long-term one, and each time the court reshapes itself like soft clay around the king's newest whim. You start to see how deeply this shaped England, not just politically, but culturally. The court became a theatre of fear. Love became law. Wives were no longer people, they were functions, roles, expected to produce heirs, obey, and disappear gracefully, preferably without requiring a scaffold. The moment a queen became too popular, too clever, too old, too independent, too loud, she was marked. The king didn't want a partner. He wanted a mirror that flattered him, and when that mirror cracked, the glass turned into a blade. But the weirdest part, people accepted it. The court didn't collapse in protest, the nobles didn't walk out, the people didn't riot. There were some uprisings, sure, like the Pilgrimage of Grace, but nothing that permanently shook Henry's grip. Why? Because absolute power was normal. Because kings were seen as God's mouthpieces. Because the lives of women, Even royal ones were still negotiable. The fallout of this legacy lingers long after Henry's death. Edward's reign is short and manipulated by Protestant protectors. Mary's reign is Catholic, brutal, and drenched in fire. Elizabeth's is the golden age, yes, but only because she learned how to operate inside the system without being swallowed by it. She weaponized the image of the Virgin Queen not just for propaganda, but for survival. She refused to marry, not because she didn't understand love, but because she understood it far too well, especially when it came attached to crowns. You see it in other monarchs too. Henry set the tone. Every ruler after him, man or woman, had to reckon with what he left behind. Not just the reformation of religion, or the rearranged succession, but the example of how power eats intimacy, of how a marriage bed can become a battlefield. His wives weren't just his companions, they were caution signs for everyone who came after. And even today, let's be honest, the name Henry VIII is still shorthand for marital disaster. He's the punchline to jokes about divorce, the go-to, symbol of toxic masculinity in tights. But buried beneath the memes and musicals is a much more dangerous legacy. He normalised the weaponization of a love. He showed the world that you could kill your wife and still get painted as a divine king in your next portrait. That's not just royal drama. That's systemic power on parade. So the next time someone brings up Henry like he's just a historical soap opera, remember, this was a man who built an entire political machine out of his emotional instability, who changed the fate of a nation because his wife didn't bear a son, who turned the throne into a guillotine for women who failed to meet impossible standards, and worst of all, people still remember him more fondly than they remember them. So now we pull the camera back, just a little, to see the bigger picture. Not just the women who married Henry VIII, but the world that made it so easy to destroy them. You're at court again. Not as a queen this time, not even a noblewoman. Maybe you're a chambermaid, a page, a musician in the gallery. Maybe you're no one at all. And yet, you're still caught in the draft of all that ambition, watching powerful men and doomed women collide like ships on fire. Because behind every royal decision, every beheading, every hurried remarriage, there's a room full of men making it all possible. The Privy Council, the King's advisors, the political architects of this royal nightmare. These are the men who smile while drawing up execution warrants, who rehearse polite lies to the public while burying another queen in scandal. You don't see them in paintings. They aren't carved into church walls, but they're always there, hovering behind the king like a wall of shadows, murmuring strategies, threats, and escape routes. Take Thomas Cromwell, for example, a man so clever he could sell water to a drowning man, and so ruthless he'd charge him for the privilege. Cromwell was the puppet master behind Anne Boleyn's downfall, orchestrating the trial with all the subtlety of a bear trap. Did he believe she was guilty? Not really. But that didn't matter. She was inconvenient. She challenged the king's authority. She didn't produce a son. And Cromwell, ever the survivor, knew that when the king wanted blood, it was better to hand him a chalice than argue about the menu. Then there's Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, who annulled Henry's marriages with a straight face and enough legal gymnastics to qualify for the Tudor Olympics. One moment he's declaring Catherine of Aragon's marriage invalid, the next he's officiating Anne Boleyn's wedding, then turning around and nullifying that one too. He baptised Elizabeth, crowned Jane Seymour, and helped write the charges that sent Catherine Howard to her death. By the end of it all, he looked less like a religious leader and more like a royal defence attorney on retainer. These men weren't just accessories to Henry's whims, they were enablers, the very machinery that turned private marital frustration into public executions. They forged confessions, threatened families, bribed witnesses, and if you were unlucky enough to be close to a queen on her way down, they wouldn't hesitate to drag you with her. Ladies-in-waiting were interrogated, brothers were accused of incest, distant cousins were swept into the mess like fallen dominoes. You didn't have to be guilty, you just had to be near. And the public? They were fed the story like it was gospel. Each queen's fall was spun into a morality play. Catherine was too stubborn, Anne too ambitious, Jane too meek, Anne of Cleves too ugly, Catherine Howard too flirtatious, Catherine Parr too intellectual, and the king, always blameless, always misunderstood, the great suffering husband endlessly betrayed by fate, never by his own fist. But none of that illusion holds if the people don't believe it. So the crown invested in pageantry, in propaganda, in spectacle. Every execution was theatre. The scaffold was a stage. The Queen's last words were rehearsed in whispers, and her death was folded into the script of royal sacrifice. It wasn't murder, it was divine necessity. The king had to behead his wife. God told him to. Or at least, that's what the official pamphlet said. And you, the court bystander, you learn to smile through it, to pretend, to whisper behind fans and pretend not to hear your friend being accused of treason. You wear black for a week when a queen dies and switch to crimson when the new one arrives. It becomes muscle memory, a cultural reflex. You're living in a system that treats queens like lit candles, burning bright and quickly, used up before they can melt too far. Even the servants learn the rhythm. They swap out tapestries while the bodies are still warm, wash the linens from the birthing chambers and the scaffold steps alike. They know that new queens arrive before the echoes of the old ones have even faded. It's grotesque in its efficiency. A human resources department with blood on its hands and a very strict timeline. And through it all, the women themselves, they are largely voiceless. Their letters are censored, their movements tracked, their reputations shredded before they can even mount a defence. Anne Boleyn's final speeches survive only through the second-hand notes of men who probably couldn't quote her if their lives depended on it. Catherine Howard's confession was rewritten 3 times before anyone agreed on which version sounded tragic enough. Even Catherine Parr, who published her own thoughts, was nearly erased when the men around her feared she might think a little too freely. The problem isn't that Henry had too much power, it's that the people around him chose to support it, to feed it, to mould it into a machine that could destroy anyone with barely a pause. The Privy Council didn't fear the king's wrath, they feared his disappointment. So they preempted it, brought him heads like birthday presents, and in doing so turned the English court into one of the most hostile workplaces in history. And you keep your head down, you pretend not to see, because the alternative is too risky. So no, the court doesn't learn from these tragedies. If anything, it gets better at hiding them. More practiced at rewriting the narrative, smoothing over the jagged edge of each queen's downfall. The same men who help remove one wife are often the ones planning the wedding for the next. The ink on the annulment is barely dry before the jewellers are polishing a new crown, and the cycle continues, because behind every king who builds a throne out of his wives' broken lives, there's a small army of advisors ready to hand him the hammer. Now take a step into the mind of a young woman at court. Not a queen, not even a noble necessarily, just someone orbiting close enough to the sun to feel the heat, but far enough that the spotlight doesn't offer protection. You've watched the parade of queens from the sidelines, seen them rise in silks and fall in blood, and you're starting to notice something deeply disturbing. The pattern, the nightmare on repeat. One woman after another, different names and dresses and titles, but the same story scribbled in slightly different ink. It's not coincidence, it's a system. 6 wives, 6 cautionary tales, each one held up like a mirror to the others. You start to realise that Henry didn't just have a string of unlucky marriages, he didn't have a bad picker. He had a process, a methodical, ruthless cycle that began with infatuation, crested at coronation, and ended in destruction. The only variable was how quickly things unravelled. Start with Catherine of Aragon. She was the standard, the long-suffering queen who gave him 20 years of loyalty and 1 surviving daughter. She gave him everything but a son, and that single failure defined her legacy in Henry's eyes. Anne Boleyn was the opposite, not docile, but dazzling. Not pious in the traditional sense, but politically electric. She got the crown, but she had to burn the kingdom to get it. Her crime wasn't heresy or adultery. It was reminding Henry that women could be powerful and still deny him control. Then came Jane Seymour. She played her hand perfectly, submissive, sweet, and conveniently dead before things could sour. Her martyrdom gave her the honour of being buried beside him. It's almost funny. She survived the game by not surviving at all. Her silence was immortalised as virtue. Anne of Cleves escaped, not by charming Henry, but by knowing when to cut her losses. She saw the writing on the wall and stepped aside before it became her tombstone, and that made her the rarest of them all, the ex-wife who lived. Catherine Howard's tragedy was speed. She was too young, too impulsive, and completely unprepared for the court's merciless spotlight. She walked into the Lion's Mouth, thinking it was a ballroom. And Catherine Parr, she was the academic, the caregiver, the one who nearly died for reading the Bible in English. She outlived him, yes, but it still killed her. So now here you are, watching the threads that connect them. Every one of these women entered the royal orbit with different strengths: faith, intelligence, beauty, obedience, and every single one was punished for it. Not for failing to be queens, but for succeeding in ways Henry didn't anticipate or couldn't control. You start to understand that being queen wasn't about ruling beside a king. It wasn't about partnership or affection. It was about performance. You had to be just enough, smart, but not smarter than him, loyal, but not political, beautiful, but not flirtatious, fertile, but not assertive. Any step outside that narrow corridor of acceptability, and you were gone. And the king? He was always the same. At first, charming, affectionate, lavish in his praise. He wrote poetry, gave gifts, whispered promises. Each new queen thought she was special, different, that she would be the one to tame him, to understand him, to save him. And for a while, maybe she did, but it never lasted, because Henry wasn't looking for a partner. He was looking for validation. And when a wife stopped providing that, whether through age disagreement or the betrayal of giving birth to a daughter, he moved on. He didn't just replace these women, he erased them. Catherine of Aragon was demoted to Dowager Princess, her daughter declared illegitimate. Anne Boleyn's name was scrubbed from official records, her portraits destroyed, her motto burned off tapestries. Even Jane Seymour, the so-called beloved wife, became a symbol rather than a person, reduced to the mother of Edward, not remembered for anything else. The queens weren't just victims of Henry, they were victims of a culture that applauded his power, fed his ego and enabled his violence, and worst of all, they were pitted against each other. Catherine versus Anne, Jane versus Anne's memory, Catherine Howard versus Catherine Parr. Even in death, they were compared, ranked, judged, like contestants in a grotesque competition with impossible rules. And what about their daughters? Mary, Elizabeth. You can't ignore the irony that Henry spent his entire reign trying to produce a male heir, and yet it was the daughters, his disappointments, who outlasted everyone. Edward ruled for 6 years, Mary ruled for 5, Elizabeth ruled for 45 years. Between them, the women he dismissed ended up shaping the future of England more than he ever did. But you wonder, what did it cost them? Mary, haunted by her mother's exile, and the pressure to restore Catholicism, turned to persecution and fire. Elizabeth, raised in a house of mirrors, learned to play the game better than anyone, but she played alone, never married, never trusted too deeply. She turned her crown into armour and ruled with a mask of golden detachment. Because how else do you survive in a world that destroyed your mother for being too bold? The more you think about it, the more the pattern makes your stomach turn. This wasn't 6 random stories. This was a system. A perfectly calibrated nightmare that expected women to be icons of virtue and punished them for having thoughts, flaws, or feelings. And that system didn't die with Henry. It just evolved. It became etiquette, laws, expectations, the need to smile when you're afraid, to flatter when you're furious, to bow even as you're bleeding. You can see it in the women around you at court, the ones who've mastered the art of staying visible enough to be useful, but invisible enough to be safe. So the next time someone tells you that being queen was a dream, you'll know better. It was a dream, maybe, but only in the way a siren song is a lullaby, beautiful, dangerous, and designed to end in silence. By now, you've figured out that this whole story, 6 queens, 2 executions, 1 bloated king, isn't really about love at all. It's about fear, or more specifically, his fear. Henry VIII, the Lion of England, defender of the faith, founder of the Church of England, and self-declared gift to women everywhere, was terrified. Not in the obvious, scream and run from danger kind of way, but in the deep, gnawing, eat you from the inside out kind of way. And like all powerful men who feel powerless beneath the armour, Henry wore his fear like a sword. He struck first, always. You start to see it once you look past the crowns and ceremonies. The grandeur was a mask, the politics a distraction. At his core, Henry was afraid of losing control, losing face, losing legacy. It started with Arthur, his brother, who died young and left Henry with a title he wasn't raised for. From the moment he took the throne, the shadow of inadequacy followed him like a bloodhound. That fear grew louder when Catherine of Aragon couldn't give him a son. He tried to bury it under tournaments and banquets, but every time another infant died, that creeping doubt returned. What if he was the problem? What if God was punishing him? What if the Tudor line died with him, and he became nothing more than a historical hiccup? So he blamed Catherine, then Anne, then the Pope, then anyone who gave him a reason to offload his panic. By the time Anne Boleyn lost her final pregnancy, Henry was consumed by the terror of dying without a male heir. He didn't mourn the miscarriages, he turned them into evidence, proof of witchcraft, of sin, of betrayal. He couldn't accept the randomness of tragedy, because randomness doesn't fit into the mind of a man obsessed with divine right. So he constructed narratives where he was always the victim, the wronged husband, the tragic monarch, the poor loyal king surrounded by faithless women, and if you think that fear mellowed with time, think again. As Henry aged, his body betrayed him. His leg refused to heal. His once proud frame ballooned into immobility. He couldn't ride, couldn't dance, couldn't perform in the ways that once defined him. He couldn't even walk without help. That kind of decline would shake any man. But for Henry, who'd built his identity on masculine vitality, it was unbearable. So his fear got sharper, meaner. Catherine Howard bore the brunt of it. Young, vibrant, desired by others, everything he no longer was. Her flirtations weren't just scandalous to Henry, they were existential threats. If she laughed with a courtier, it meant he wasn't enough. If she wrote a note, it meant she was mocking him. He couldn't handle the idea that someone might love someone else more than him, so he punished her. Publicly. Brutally. It wasn't just a beheading, it was a warning. Don't you dare remind me I'm mortal. Even Catherine Parr, the calm, diplomatic sixth wife, triggered his insecurity. Her theological interests made her dangerous, not because she was trying to reform England in her own image, but because she read books and asked questions. And Henry, who once wrote essays defending the Catholic Church, couldn't stomach being intellectually outpaced. So, as always, he prepared to strike, arrest her for heresy, silence her, until she said exactly what he needed to hear. "I'm only trying to distract you from your pain, my king." The flattery worked. He backed down. But that close call tells you everything about where Henry's head was in his final years. Paranoid, defensive, one polite disagreement away from snapping. What makes it worse, what cements his legacy as more than just a messy monarch, is that everyone around him knew. His advisors, his courtiers, his wives. They all saw the fear behind the throne, and they adapted. They flattered him more, hid bad news, gave him scapegoats, because challenging Henry's narrative was a shortcut to the tower. Even ambassadors from other countries tiptoed around his ego. They sent portraits that flattered him, letters dripping in titles, gifts that reinforced his self-image. Everyone participated in the charade, because the truth that Henry VIII was terrified of being forgotten was too dangerous to say out loud, and in the end, his fear wasn't entirely misplaced. His beloved son Edward died young. His church, the Church of England, split into factions that he wouldn't even recognise. The Tudor dynasty ended with Elizabeth, childless and famously unmarried. The very legacy he tore his country apart to preserve died with her. He broke 6 women, killed 2, and rewrote the religious map of Europe, all to avoid being forgotten. And yet, the future he feared came anyway. But ironically, it's that very fear, the bloody theatrical spiralling panic, that made him unforgettable. Historians still debate him, artists still paint him, dramatists still bring him back to life again and again in stage plays and novels, and Netflix dramas with bad accents. We remember him not because he was wise or benevolent or revolutionary, we remember him because he was afraid, and because that fear turned him into something monstrous. You start to realise that this pattern isn't exclusive to Henry. You've seen it elsewhere, men who can't handle losing power, who wrap themselves in ego and call it destiny, who silence women not because they're wrong, but because they're right. It's not just history, it's human nature, dressed in velvet robes and crowned with gold. And the wives? They were never the problem, they were the collateral. So yes, Henry VIII left his mark, but it wasn't the mark he intended. He wanted eternal glory. Instead, he became the cautionary tale, the man who built an empire out of fear and called it love. It always came back to the womb, that small, silent chamber inside every queen, filled with expectation, dread, and more political weight than the Tower of London itself. For Henry VIII, it wasn't just about having a wife, it was about having a factory, a perfectly tuned, obedient, royal-grade vessel for male heirs. Fertility wasn't private in this world, it was the heartbeat of the entire monarchy, and if you were a woman anywhere near the Tudor throne, your body stopped belonging to you the moment you stepped onto the palace floor. You weren't expected to have ideas, you were expected to have sons, plural. Ideally in quick succession, with enough surviving to prevent a civil war the second the king dropped dead. It was understood, even whispered with pride, that a queen's worth could be measured in healthy infant boys. Nothing else mattered. Not beauty, not intelligence, not loyalty. The second your body failed at that singular task, you weren't just a disappointment, you were dangerous. It didn't matter how strong you were. Catherine of Aragon withstood exile, betrayal and heartbreak, but the failure to give Henry a living son made her disposable. Anne Boleyn had a daughter, Elizabeth no less, but the lack of a son was interpreted as a divine judgment. Her final miscarriage sealed her fate. Jane Seymour bore the elusive boy, Edward, and was instantly canonised in Henry's mind, even though she died 2 weeks later, and the rest, forgotten, annulled, or worse. The pressure wasn't subtle, it wasn't romantic, it was scientific in its cruelty. The moment a queen became pregnant, the entire court pivoted to that singular fact. Her meals were controlled, her movements monitored. Servants were assigned not for her comfort but for surveillance, and the entire kingdom waited with bated breath, not for her health, but for the midwife's cry of, "It's a boy!" You can feel it in the way people talk to her. Every conversation loops back to children. "How are you feeling, Your Grace?" Translation. "Do you feel male movement in your belly?" "You're glowing, Majesty." Translation. "Don't you dare miscarry." Even the clothes queens wore changed. Maternity gowns were cut to emphasise modesty, but they were still stiff with embroidery depicting fertility symbols. Pomegranates, vines, the Virgin Mary holding the Christ child like a loaded weapon of pressure. And when a baby didn't survive, when the belly went soft too soon or the blood came too late, it was always her fault. Always. Never Henry's. Never the endless stress. Never the limited understanding of reproductive health. Just her body, her failure. And sometimes that failure came with punishment. Historians still argue about Anne Boleyn's final pregnancy. Some claim she was carrying a boy, lost in a miscarriage triggered by stress after Henry's flirtation with Jane Seymour became public. Others think it was a stillbirth, or worse, that she was never pregnant at all and fabricated symptoms to buy herself time. But regardless of the truth, the result was the same. No son, no security, just silence, and soon after, the executioner's sword. It's chilling how medical ignorance only amplified the fear. Miscarriages weren't understood. Neither were hormonal conditions, infections, or genetic complications. Everything was interpreted as a sign, a curse, proof of sin. It wasn't just heartbreaking, it was political evidence. If a queen lost a baby, it was considered a statement from God himself. And if God wasn't blessing the marriage, then clearly the marriage needed to end. The irony, of course, is that Henry was the common denominator. 6 marriages, 1 legitimate son. That's not exactly a dazzling batting average, but no one dared say it. To suggest that the problem might be his was unthinkable, treasonous even. His virility was untouchable, enshrined in portraiture and performance. The fault had to lie with the women. Convenient, really. And so, queens weren't just marrying a king, they were signing up for a biological exam with national consequences. They became walking wombs, surrounded by expectations so heavy, you're surprised they didn't collapse under the pressure of it. And if they tried to resist, if they wanted to be more than mothers, well, that never ended well. Anne Boleyn tried to be a queen and a political partner. Catherine Parr tried to be a queen and a writer. Catherine Howard tried to be a queen and a girl still figuring out who she was. Every time the roles clashed, and the womb won, or didn't, which meant the whole woman lost. Even after death, their bodies were treated as emblems. Jane Seymour's remains were entombed beside Henry's, not for love, but because she died having done her duty. Her son, Edward, didn't live long enough to fulfill the legacy she brought with her life, but that hardly mattered. Her value had been set. Her story frozen at the moment she produced the only son Henry could claim without shame. And what about the daughters? Mary, Elizabeth, both declared illegitimate at different points, both tossed, around like political cards in a game of Tudor poker. Their worth fluctuated not based on their intellect, but on whether their mothers had lived long enough to deliver a boy. They weren't people. They were footnotes in someone else's reproductive resume. It would be one thing if this were just Henry, just one unstable monarch with a god complex. But this obsession with the royal womb echoed far beyond his reign. Every royal woman after was expected to be part wife, part symbol, part sacrificial offering. Even Elizabeth, brilliant as she was, spent half her reign dodging the question of marriage and childbirth like arrows. She knew exactly what it meant. One pregnancy could crown her, or kill her, either physically or in the public's perception, and she wasn't about to gamble her autonomy for that. You start to understand why Elizabeth wore armour, why she called herself married to the nation, why she styled herself as the Virgin Queen. Because she saw the inside of the game, she was born into it, and she knew, better than anyone, that the womb had never been a throne. It had always been a trap. If you peel back the brocade and silk of the Tudor court, brush away the gold leaf and Latin hymns, what you find underneath isn't royalty, it's survival, especially for women. Being a queen under Henry VIII was less about power and more about navigating a maze of knives. You weren't ruling, you were performing, placating, pretending. And for every public moment, the coronations, the royal progresses, the feasts, there were hours of private desperation. Whispers behind tapestries, glances traded like bribes, women learning day by day how to stay one step ahead of a man who could change the course of their life with a flick of his wrist. So how did they do it? How did Henry's wives, and the women around them, manage to survive as long as they did in a world where one misstep could mean a scaffold? They schemed. Not out of malice, but out of necessity. Survival required courtly espionage. Alliances with ladies-in-waiting, careful conversations with ambassadors, coded letters slipped through servants' hands. The palace may have been gilded, but it was basically a war zone, and the women weren't bystanders. They were tacticians. Catherine of Aragon had her Spanish entourage, ladies and chaplains loyal to her first, the English crown second. Even when Henry tried to exile her, she leaned on her network, kept communication lines open, and refused to fade quietly. She made herself a symbol of resistance, and it worked. For years. When she stood before Henry and the court proclaiming her marriage lawful, she wasn't just making an emotional plea. She was delivering a practice performance, a masterclass in public manipulation, and the people loved her for it. Even as the king tried to erase her, she became a martyr in velvet. Anne Boleyn played a different game. She knew the court's currency, charm, intelligence, exclusivity. She refused Henry's advances for years, stringing him along like a master puppeteer until he rewrote religion to marry her. That's not luck, that's calculation. She aligned herself with reformers, kept a tight circle of informants, and studied her rivals carefully. But even Anne, brilliant, magnetic, quick-witted Anne, couldn't keep pace with the machinery once it turned against her. She'd stepped too far into the spotlight, and when it turned into a searchlight, there was nowhere left to run. Then there was Jane Seymour, the master of subtlety. Jane wasn't flashy. She didn't argue with Henry or parade her opinions in front of ambassadors, but she listened. She waited. She knew that silence could be powerful. When Anne Boleyn fell, Jane didn't cheer. She stepped delicately into the vacancy, said little, and produced a son. She didn't need to survive long. She just needed to succeed once. Her death was unfortunate, but it froze her in perfection. No one would ever know if she'd have become troublesome. She became the sainted mother figure before the court could tire of her. Anne of Cleves? She played the long game. The second Henry made it clear he found her unattractive, she adjusted. She smiled, agreed to the annulment, and pocketed the payout. But behind that strategic humility was a sharp mind. Anne learned English. She assimilated. She kept herself visible, but non-threatening. She navigated court events with the grace of someone who knew exactly what had nearly happened to her, and how close she came to having her head on the block. It wasn't cowardice. It was clarity. Catherine Howard had no such clarity. She was young, impressionable, and wildly unprepared for the snakes she found herself dancing with. Her survival tactics were flirtation and charm, which, under other circumstances, might have worked. But she underestimated the danger. She didn't build a network. She didn't guard her secrets. She assumed youth would protect her, and it didn't. Catherine Parr, though, she read the room like a chessboard. She knew who was Catholic, who was Protestant, who whispered in the king's ear before bed. She carefully threaded her ideas into religious discussions without overstepping, until she did. And when she was almost arrested, she knew the only way to survive was to flatter the king's ego so perfectly that he forgot he'd ever doubted her. That's not luck. That's mental gymnastics on a royal scale. But it wasn't just the queens. Their ladies-in-waiting had their own quiet strategies. A wrong friendship could get you interrogated. A missed curtsy could get you dismissed. The walls had ears, and the ears had daggers. Information was the only real currency at court, and the women who held it were both powerful and expendable. You kept your head by knowing exactly what to say, when to say it, and how to say just enough without becoming suspicious. You couldn't just be loyal. You had to be perceived as loyal. That meant controlling every movement, every expression, every stitch of your gown. Everything was political. The jewellery you wore might signify allegiance to a queen. The pattern embroidered on your sleeves could link you to a faction. Even a glance at the wrong person during mass could mark you as a traitor. The court wasn't a place. It was a performance, and every woman there was an actor whose life depended on never flubbing a line. And it wasn't just about avoiding death. It was about protecting what little autonomy you could scavenge. A safe marriage, a daughter placed in a good household, a brother granted a post. These weren't luxuries. They were the spoils of survival. Every woman at court, no matter how refined or religious or seemingly docile, had to play the game. Even Elizabeth, watching from the sidelines as a girl, absorbed every tactic. She saw how silence could shield, how charm could distract, how intelligence had to be hidden in lace and humility. The myth is that these women were helpless, that they were dragged through history by a mad king and left to die in the dust of his ambition. But that's not the truth. They weren't helpless. They were trapped. And within that trap they did everything they could to survive, with courage, cunning, and the unshakable knowledge that one wrong breath could be their last. Because being queen wasn't the end of the game. It was the most dangerous square on the board. By the time Henry's final days arrive, the palace corridors reek of illness and unease. Part sweat, part infection, part something hard to name. It's not just the man who's dying. It's the court itself, sagging under the weight of secrets and rot. His last years are spent mostly confined to his chambers, enormous and ulcerated, propped up like a wax figure in clothes he can barely fit into. His appetite remains insatiable, but the rest of him is shutting down inch by inch. The air around him grows dense with fear. Everyone knows the end is coming, but no one dares say it aloud. Because when Henry VIII dies, he won't just leave a crown behind. He'll leave a vacuum, and the people in his orbit are already lining up to fill it. The Privy Council is busy playing chess while pretending to pray. Courtiers whisper behind velvet curtains. Ambassadors send frantic letters to their monarchs abroad, all trying to guess which way the wind will blow once the old lion finally breathes his last. The real game isn't about mourning, it's about positioning. And the women? They're watching it all, from the sidelines as always, with expressions carved from granite. Because they've seen how fast favour turns to danger, how quickly a soft goodbye can become a political trap. Meanwhile, the royal spin machine revs into high gear. Official statements about the king's health are crafted with surgical vagueness. He's resting. He's attending to matters of state. He's receiving spiritual counsel. What he's actually doing is deteriorating both mentally and physically. He spends long hours groaning in bed, unable to walk, lashing out at servants, and demanding constant attention. His ulcers stink. His moods turn on a pin. The same king who once danced in tournaments and penned love songs now can't even climb the stairs without being carried like an overgrown toddler in robes. And still, no one dares displease him. He's not a man anymore. He's a force, an institution, a myth that nobody wants to be caught puncturing too soon. So the court goes through the motions. The musicians still play. The cooks still prepare feasts. Courtiers still argue over titles and land. While just a few rooms away, The once mighty king is wheezing through every breath. He becomes something between a relic and a tyrant, half god, half corpse. This is the moment where public image and private decay collide in full. You see how hard the crown has to work to maintain appearances. The stained glass version of Henry, the righteous king, the patriarch, the anointed ruler, is projected constantly, even as the real man lies soaked in his own sweat, snapping at doctors and dreaming of old battles. The propaganda doesn't die with him. It gets louder. Statues, portraits, official histories. They erase the worst parts and double down on the glory, because England needs a hero, not a cautionary tale. But for those who lived close to him, especially the women, it's impossible to forget what he really was. They remember how he wept when Jane Seymour gave him a son, how he raged when Catherine of Aragon refused to be dismissed quietly, how his hand trembled with fury when Anne Boleyn dared to argue with him. They remember the shouting, the silence, the way he used love as a leash and power as a blade. Even as he lies dying, the rules don't change. His last queen, Catherine Parr, plays her role with painful precision, reading him religious texts, massaging his swollen limbs, offering comfort without emotion. She's not mourning him. She's managing him, making sure she gets out of this alive. She already knows that the second he dies, everything she's been granted could vanish if she doesn't act fast. Henry loved to elevate and destroy in equal measure, and no one knows what his final orders might be until they're read aloud like royal scripture. And what about his children? Little Edward is being prepped like a porcelain heir, surrounded by tutors and expectations, but too young to understand the gravity of what's coming. Mary and Elizabeth, the surviving daughters from different discarded wives, linger in the margins, legitimised, then delegitimised, then legitimised again depending on Henry's mood. Their futures hinge entirely on who wins the court scramble once the king stops breathing. It's the end of an era, but no one's dancing on the grave yet. The damage he's done doesn't go with him into the tomb. It lingers. It calcifies. You see it in the strained smiles of the ladies in waiting, in the frantic shifting of alliances, in the way the servants avoid eye contact when carrying trays into Henry's room. Everyone is already performing the next act of the royal drama, pretending this death is dignified, pretending this ending is just another chapter in a glorious reign. But it's not glorious. It's grotesque. This is a man who tore apart a religion to get a divorce, who killed wives like pests, who couldn't tolerate disobedience or the sight of weakness, and now, in the final days, he is nothing but weakness. No sons at his side, no adoring wife, just the stink of his own failures and a court too scared to admit it. When he finally dies, January 28th, 1547, the news spreads not with mourning but with relief. Quiet, careful, trembling relief. His death is announced with ceremony. The bells ring, the prayers begin. But behind the formalities, people are moving fast. Estates are being claimed, documents rewritten, wills produced like weapons. Henry's body may be en route to Windsor, sealed in lead and draped in velvet, but his real legacy is already being torn into pieces. And yet, he's not forgotten. Not really. Because the culture he cultivated, of fear, obedience and silence, doesn't vanish when the coffin lid closes. It lingers. It seeps into every throne room that comes after, every debate about female rulers, every whispered question about whether a woman can be powerful without being punished. Henry may be gone, but the machinery he built, that keeps grinding. And if you were one of his wives, or one of the women unlucky enough to watch from the sidelines, you don't need a funeral procession to remember him. You've got scars. Even after the king is buried, deep beneath the floor of St. George's Chapel at Windsor, beside the wife who died before she could disappoint him, the work of his reign doesn't stop. It reverberates, echoes through chambers he'll never walk again. His wives are gone or fading, his children now chess pieces in a larger game, and yet somehow he is still here. Not in body, but in the policies, the customs, the trauma etched into the bones of the court. Every corner of England still carries the bruises of Henry's obsessions, and for women, especially those near power, the rules haven't changed, only the names have. You notice it most clearly in how the court treats widows and princesses after Henry's death. Take Catherine Parr. She survives him by a breath, remarries, gets pregnant, dies. That should have been the end of it. But people don't forget she was his wife. Her legacy becomes tangled in his even after she's cold in the ground. The court rewrites her story to fit its needs. She becomes the good wife, the wise nurse, a footnote to his decline rather than the intelligent, reform-minded woman she actually was. Elizabeth, on the other hand, has learned, and learned well. She moves through court like a ghost with a crown, saying little, observing everything. Every encounter is strategic, every relationship a calculated risk. She's been burned before, accused, questioned, locked in the tower by her own sister. She's seen what happens when a woman gets too close to power without being married, and she's decided she won't be just another queen, she'll be the queen. But even in her rise, you can hear Henry's voice echoing. Not literally, he's dead, thankfully, but through the expectations that cling to her like dust. The question everyone asks, who will she marry? Will she secure the dynasty? Will she give us a prince? Nobody wants another round of succession chaos. Everyone wants the same thing Henry did, a neat patriarchal lineage with boys lined up like soldiers, and when Elizabeth says she won't marry, people smile like it's a charming phase, a clever deflection. Surely she doesn't mean it. Oh, she means it. Because Elizabeth has seen firsthand that marriage doesn't protect you, it exposes you. She was raised on the wreckage of 6 queens. Her childhood was built on whispers, severed alliances and blood-stained petticoats. She knows what it means to be called a harlot because of your mother, to be a political liability because of your gender, to be viewed as a vessel instead of a ruler. She doesn't just carry that history, she wears it, every day like armour stitched from silence. So she rejects it all, the suitors, the councils begging her to wed, the foreign dignitaries offering treaties in exchange for her womb. She gives them flirtation, diplomacy, ceremony, but never herself. It drives her advisors mad, but it also gives her something no Tudor woman before her ever truly had: control. And yet, that control doesn't come without consequences. Elizabeth is constantly under scrutiny, more so than any male monarch before her. Her every choice is dissected. Her clothes, her speeches, her friendships. The rumour mill works over time. Is she in love with Robert Dudley? Is she barren? Is she even a virgin? Or just using the image to manipulate her court? You'd think ruling a kingdom would be enough, but in the wake of Henry's reign, it's never enough. Women are still judged by what they can offer men, even queens. Elizabeth spends her entire life balancing the expectations Henry cemented with the legacy she's determined to build. And that legacy? It's complicated. Yes, she oversees a golden age of culture, exploration and military power, but she also inherits a broken system. A country divided by religion, weighed down by outdated laws, and stained with the blood of her mother and countless others. She rules over it brilliantly, but she never escapes it. You see the same patterns in the women who come after. Henry may be gone, but his blueprint survives. Courtship is still political, fertility is still fate. Queens, consorts or regnants are still expected to walk the same tightrope between saint and seductress, between silence and spectacle. And if they fall, the world points at them. Not the men, not the system, them. It makes you wonder, was Henry the disease or just the symptom? Because let's face it, he didn't invent misogyny. He didn't create the laws that made women property or the customs that treated their bodies like public policy. But he embodied it so perfectly that it's impossible to separate the man from the machine. His reign didn't just reflect patriarchy, it weaponized it. And the fact that we still talk about him, that he's more famous than most of the women he ruined, proves how well that weapon worked. But there's a shift happening. Quiet, slow, but real. Historians are starting to ask new questions. They're looking at Anne Boleyn's letters. They're re-examining Catherine Howard's age and vulnerability. They're translating Catherine Parr's writings not as devotional fluff, but as feminist groundwork. People are beginning to see that the queens weren't just passive victims. They were players, survivors, in some cases revolutionaries. Their stories deserve more than the rhyme. Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. They deserve full voices, not just tragic endings. Because the nightmare wasn't that they married a monster. It's that the world kept pretending he wasn't one. You're standing in the museum now, centuries later. Fluorescent lights instead of candlelight. Security guards instead of palace guards. The past behind glass, curated and sanitized, each artifact labelled with a little white card in clean, sterile font. A portrait of Henry VIII looms large, literally fleshy face, small eyes, thick neck cradled in fur. He looks smug, bloated with self-satisfaction. Tourists snap photos. A school group gathers as a guide explains this is King Henry VIII. He had 6 wives. And someone in the back laughs. It's always a joke. 6 wives. Can you believe it? But you can't laugh, because now you know what it cost. You stare at the painting and you realise we made him into a meme, a punchline, a musical number with snapping fingers and brightly coloured dresses, divorced, beheaded, died, again and again, like it's a game. A man destroys 6 women, 2 of them executed, several discarded, one driven to her grave, and we call it iconic, historical, entertainment. But if it happened today, we'd call it abuse. This is the part that stings. History loves Henry. Not adores, necessarily, but loves to tell his story. He dominates the narrative. Volumes written about him. Documentaries narrated with dramatic baritones. His portrait is recognisable even to people who couldn't name half his wives. He's the monarch people remember. Why? Because he was loud. Because he changed things. Because he was scandalous enough to stick. The women, they get margins, paragraphs, cautionary footnotes. Anne Boleyn is remembered more for losing her head than reshaping a church. Catherine of Aragon is remembered for being divorced, not for being the first queen to openly challenge a king in public. Jane Seymour is remembered for dying cleanly. Catherine Howard is remembered as a flirt, not a traumatised teenager. Their legacies were reduced to how useful, or disposable, they were to Henry's story. You want to reach into the glass and rip the storyboards apart, rearrange the names, give them centre stage. You want to ask the docents why Catherine Parr's theological writings are shelved behind Henry's religious pamphlets, why Anne of Cleves' marriage is treated like a diplomatic hiccup instead of a strategic act of self-preservation, why Catherine Howard's age is listed so matter-of-factly next to the term adulteress, as if being 16 absolves no one of her fate. There's something deeply unsettling about how we choose to remember him. We paint him as complicated, tragic, bold. We say he was a product of his time, that he was under pressure, that he had to do these things, for the dynasty, for stability. We invent layers of sympathy that were never extended to the women beneath him. When Henry fails, we excuse it as political burden. When his wives fail, we call it fatal. And yet, here in the museum there are glimmers of something different. You find a tiny exhibit on Elizabeth, Henry's daughter, with an inscription that reads, "She inherited her mother's wit and her father's ruthlessness." The phrasing grates a little. It still defines her by both parents, but at least it names her mother. Anne Boleyn isn't invisible here. Neither is Catherine Parr, whose published book lies in a corner under soft light, the spine creased, a single quote highlighted. "Knowledge is the food of the soul. It's not much, but it's something. A seed." And that's what this whole thing is, isn't it? A reckoning. A slow reclaiming of stories long buried under royal myth and male legacy. We're just beginning to unearth what it meant to be a queen in Henry's court. What it meant to navigate a world where your entire value was pinned to your ability to birth sons and keep your mouth shut. You think about what those women would say if they could speak now, not through historians or documentaries, but directly. Would Catherine of Aragon smirk and say, "Told you so"? Would Anne Boleyn glare at the wax figure of Henry and say, "You call him charismatic"? Would Catherine Howard be furious that her story was ever reduced to scandal? Would Catherine Parr roll her eyes at the display case and mutter, "This is what I get for publishing theology"? Maybe they'd just be tired. Tired of being studied but not understood. Tired of being remembered through a man who never truly saw them as people. And yet, they are being remembered. Not just as Henry's wives, but as individuals. Scholars are revisiting Anne's influence on religious reform. They're rereading Catherine Parr's prayers through a feminist lens. They're finally treating Catherine Howard as a girl exploited in a system designed to fail her. The narrative is shifting, one detail at a time. It's not perfect. The memes still fly. The rhyme still repeats. But you can feel the weight starting to move. You can see the glint of recognition in modern audiences, especially women, who look at those 6 names and think, I've been underestimated too. I've had to smile through danger. I've been asked to make myself small so someone else could feel big. So maybe there's justice in that. Not in execution or exile, but in reclamation. The wives are getting their names back, their voices, their stories. They're not just Henry's anymore, and neither is history. Now close your eyes for a moment. Not all the way. Just enough to blur the museum lighting, to let the portrait soften around the edges. You're not in the present anymore. You're somewhere else. Somewhere dimly lit, candle-scented, heavy with the murmur of silk and ambition. Maybe it's Whitehall. Maybe Greenwich. Maybe some corridor with worn stone and too many secrets packed between the cracks. You can almost hear footsteps, the clink of goblets, the rustle of gowns that could double as armour. You've stepped back into Henry's world. But this time, you know what to look for. You see a woman now, alone in her chamber. Not one in particular. She could be any of them. Catherine, Anne, Jane. She's sitting at a writing desk, quill in hand, staring down at a piece of parchment she knows may never be read. Maybe it's a letter to her family, or a prayer, or a quiet line of poetry scrawled in Latin. Something just for herself. Because despite the gowns and jewels, the royal feasts and trumpets, this is what her life has come down to. Survival through silence, expression through code, identity held together by ink and will. You've heard her story a dozen ways by now. The obedient wife, the seductress, the peacemaker, the schemer, the whore, the martyr, the survivor. She's been cast and recast through history's theatre, played by every actress with a corset and a crown. But here, in this quiet moment, she's just a woman trying to hold on to who she is while everything around her insists she's someone else. And the world hasn't changed nearly as much as we like to think. Women still get rewritten, still get framed through the lens of the powerful men around them, still get blamed for the things they couldn't control, and punished for the things they could. History might have better lighting now, but the old shadows remain. They stretch, they linger, especially when no one bothers to name them. You open your eyes, and you're back in your world again. The exhibit ends. The audio guide finishes with something vaguely celebratory. The school group has moved on to the gift shop buying magnets with Henry's scowling face, but you're still, standing there in front of the timeline of wives staring at that familiar, infuriating rhyme etched in glossy vinyl on the wall. Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. It's catchy, it's clever, it's clinically accurate, but it's also incomplete. It doesn't tell you that Catherine of Aragon led armies in her husband's absence, that Anne Boleyn's wit reshaped England's faith, that Jane Seymour died fulfilling the one task Henry couldn't let go, that Anne of Cleves outlived them all and outmanoeuvred the court, that Catherine Howard never stood a chance, that Catherine Parr educated a future queen, survived a tyrant, and published under her own name when most women were still being taught not to speak. That rhyme doesn't tell you who they were, but maybe now you know, because being Henry VIII's wife wasn't just unfortunate. It was a blueprint for how women in power could be glorified, crushed, adored, erased. It was a cycle built not on personal failure but on structural cruelty. They weren't married to a man, they were chained to an institution that fed on their bodies, their minds, their reputations. And when it was done, it spat them out, labelled and judged, their real selves buried under centuries of simplification. Still, they endured. In poems, in portraits, in the children who carried their names forward, even when those names were tainted. In the cracks of official histories, where their real voices slipped through like light under a locked door. They endured in silence, in rebellion, in laughter over goblets of wine when the king wasn't looking. And now, they endure in us. In every woman who has ever had to make herself small to stay safe. In every woman who has learned to walk the tightrope between likability and power. In every woman who has been told she's too much, or not enough. In every woman who has survived a system that was never built for her to win. So maybe, in the end, Henry VIII wasn't just a monster. Maybe he was a mirror. And what we see in him, what we choose to laugh at, to excuse, to romanticize, says more about us than it ever did about him. Let's stop laughing. Let's start listening. Let's tell the whole story. So, here we are at the edge of it all. The lights have dimmed. The court is silent. The wives are gone. The king is long dead, tucked in his tomb next to the woman who, by pure chance and perfect timing, died before she could displease him. The story's finished, but the ache lingers, soft, persistent, like a bruise you keep pressing just to remember it's real. Because no matter how many centuries pass, no matter how many stage productions or costume dramas we wrap around the past, the truth remains. Being Henry VIII's wife was never a fairy tale, it was a warning. Tonight you didn't just walk through history, you stood in the shoes of women who were expected to carry an empire on their backs, and be grateful for the opportunity. You watched them rise and fall and rise again in memory. And now that you've seen them clearly, not just as names in a rhyme, but as people, it's hard to forget. That's a good thing. Hold on to that discomfort. It means you're paying attention. So take a breath. Let it go. Just a little. You made it. You survived the court. You outlasted the tyrant. You kept your head. And tomorrow, when someone casually jokes about Henry and his 6 wives, maybe you'll tilt your head and say, sure, but do you know what it cost them? And maybe, just maybe, that will be enough to crack open a new conversation. Now, sleep easy. The palace ghosts are quiet for now. The crown rests on its velvet pillow. You've seen what lies beneath it, and you've earned your rest.